3:11 The last. A few days passed in tense anticipation. Sunny spent them doing the same things he had been doing before, training and preparing mentally for what was about to come. He had a lot of things to do. First came his technique, which was based on the flowing battle style that Nephi's had taught him, with elements of Shadow Saint's grounded style added to its adaptive foundation. His skill was growing sharper and sharper, slowly being elevated and solidified at the level that his current understanding of combat allowed. Sunny was not a novice anymore. He survived hundreds of deadly battles, and each left him stronger and more experienced than he had been before. But perfecting his technique was still not easy, because he had to make himself indomitable first, and then turn that firmness into flexibility. Now that Sunny finally had free time, he also used it to adapt his style to the new reality of his improved physical limits. Many things that had not been possible for him before the journey to the Hollow Mountains became possible now. The way he approached combat had to change, too. All of it took effort and a lot of thought to achieve. Second came the shadow dance. Sunny was still at the stage where he was slowly forming a practical set of moves to train in that elusive style. He felt as if he was now only one final step away from turning his vision of the shadow dance into reality. However, he seemed to be lacking some crucial ingredients. He needed one last push, one moment of inspiration to make that final step. Still, his exercises weren't useless. Until that moment of inspiration came, they helped condition his body and mind, making them adaptable and malleable like shadows. When the last revelation appeared, they would be able to receive it. After each intense training session, every muscle in his body ached, and a wave of mental fatigue washed over him. Third came the most important task. He had to turn his mind and soul into a fortress that would withstand the shock of the future. He had to achieve the type of clarity that would allow him to emerge victorious on the other end of it all, and for now, this task was turning out to be the most unattainable. It was hard to shape one's body and mind into a perfect tool, but it was so much harder to do the same with one's soul. However, this was exactly the barrier he had to overcome. Just like that, 6 days passed. On the 7th day after his departure, Kai finally returned. The charming young man seemed tired and ragged, his armor and clothes covered in dirt, dust, and dried blood. The quiver of arrows he had taken with him was now empty, and there were shallow cuts on the fabric of his jacket. Sunny's shadow had kept watching the skies above the bright castle all this time, so he was one of the first to know. By the time Sunny arrived at the small room that served as Nef's council chamber, Kai was already there, sitting by the fire and greedily drinking water from a crude clay cup. Effie was by his side, pushing a plate of food into his hands. Noticing him, Kai smiled weakly. "Hey, Sunny." Sunny hesitated for a bit, then approached the beautiful young man and patted him on the shoulder. "Hey, Kai. Welcome back." Neither he nor Effie spoke after that, giving their friend an opportunity to catch his breath and waiting for the rest to come. One after another, Cassie, Castor, and Seishan appeared in the room and greeted Kai. Nephi's was the last to enter. She glanced at everyone and then sat down near Kai. After hesitating for a few moments, she looked him in the eyes and asked, "How many?" Kai remained silent for a while, a solemn expression slowly appearing in his eyes. Finally, he turned away and sighed. One word escaped his lips. "None." His voice echoed in the small room, making the faces of people gathered there darken. I scoured the labyrinth, looking for any sign that a sleeper passed there recently. But there were none. There was no one alive and no bodies, not even a single fresh bone that I could find. The spell, it did not send anyone to this hell. Not this year. And it won't the next one, too. Just as I thought. Sunny sighed. Sometimes, it was nice to be mistaken. 15 years ago, the spell had sent 7 people to the Forgotten Shore. The next year it had been twice as much, and then more and more. Eventually, hundreds of sleepers had been arriving in the Dark City after each winter solstice, up until last year, when only 4 of them, Sunny, Nephi's, Cassie, and Castor, had come. 3 more had perished in the labyrinth without ever reaching the cursed ruins. Because of that, the inhabitants of Bright Castle came up with a theory that the number of people sent to this region of the dream realm by the spell followed a certain cycle. If they had been right, then at least 14 sleepers would have appeared somewhere in the labyrinth a week ago. But Sunny never believed in that theory. In his mind, the 4 of them had never been meant to start a new cycle. He had always thought that, instead, they were meant to be the last chance the spell had given to the people of the Forgotten Shore. And now, he knew that he had been right. With a sigh, Nephi slowly nodded and stared at the fire burning in the hearth for a bit. Everyone stood silently, waiting for her to make a decision. Finally, she said without looking at them, "Tell everyone to gather in the throne room. I will speak to them." Without wasting any time, Castor bowed slightly and left the room. Effie gave her a short look and then followed him.
So, did the rest.
Sunny was the last one to leave, his heart beating like a drum. It is beginning. Chapter 3:12 Invisible Chains. 500 people stood silently in the magnificent great hall of the ancient castle. Beams of sunlight were falling through the tall windows, making the air appear bright and effervescent. There was no sign left of the terrible bloodshed that had happened in this hall just a few weeks ago. The bodies were dragged away, the blood washed off the marble floors. But the memory of it remained. On the steps leading to a beautiful throne of white marble sat a young woman with silver hair. Her ivory face was distant, and her clear gray eyes were calm and heavy. Hundreds of people were looking at her, waiting quietly for their lady to speak. Finally, Changing Star sighed. A moment later, her voice resounded in the throne room, reaching far and wide. Dreamers of the Forgotten Shore. A week ago, I sent several scouts into the labyrinth to look for those young men and women who, like us, were sent to this cursed place. Among them was Nightingale, whom you all know. He spent 7 days searching for them, but he didn't find anyone. Not even a single sign of their passing. This year, no one has come. A wave of stunned whispers ran through the crowd. Sunny glanced at the faces of people gathered in the great hall, noticing different expressions on them. Confusion, fear, shock. However, it wasn't as bad as he had expected. No one seemed to become consumed by utter despair. Instead, all of them turned to Nephi's, hope burning in their eyes. She was their hope. Until Changing Star was with them, they weren't going to give in to despair. Indifferent to hundreds of eyes observing her every move, Neph continued. Many of you understand what that means. To those who don't, I will explain. She lingered for a moment, throwing a glance at the walls of the ancient citadel. When she spoke, her voice seemed solemn. For many years, this castle served as a fortress for the humans sent to the Forgotten Shore. Some of you enjoyed the safety it offered, while others survived in the shadow of its walls. But none of us would have been here if not for the bright castle. It offered us protection against the dreadful beasts of the Dark City. It offered us shelter. However, this shelter was never free. A dark expression appeared on her face. Some people lost their souls to preserve it, and many more lost their lives. Every year, hundreds of human lives were sacrificed to allow the bright castle to exist. And every year, hundreds more came to be thrown into its maw. Sunny silently scoffed. She was making it sound as though the castle was some creature that fed on human lives, not unlike the Soul Devourer, really. The meaning was subtle enough to not be obvious, but still affected the people gathered in the throne room. Observing them, he saw many sleepers shiver and frown. Insidious. Meanwhile, Nephi continued. But no more. There won't be anyone coming to the Dark City this year, just like no one will come after that. Without new people, the losses we suffer will slowly accumulate until there is no one to man the walls, no one to fight off the nightmare creatures, no one to keep these halls safe. Until there is no more shelter. This end, she made a pause, and then said calmly and with frightening finality, is inevitable. Her words crashed into the crowd of sleepers, causing a storm of emotions. Their eyes widened and their faces paled. The shock and fear they had felt grew tenfold. As if to hammer the last nail into the coffin of their worldview, Changing Star said, which means only one thing. We cannot remain in the bright castle anymore. Screams rose from the crowd, full of disbelief and terror. There were many things people were trying to say, but they all boiled down to 3. What do we do? How do we save ourselves? and save us, changing star. Sunny smiled. Nephice remained silent for a while, letting the chorus of screams wash over her. And then, white flames ignited in her eyes, making everyone fall silent. Her voice resounded once more between the walls of the great hall, penetrating through the crowd like a sharp blade. But this is not the end of us. A long time ago, I made you a promise, and I intend to keep it. She suddenly rose, towering over the crowd like a shining, ruinous angel. Come with me. Follow me. Only I know how to save you. The radiance of her flames reflected in the eyes of hundreds of people, making it seem as though their faces shone with an inner light. Her words had submerged them into utter darkness and then gave them a beacon to find a way out of it. That beacon burned with the most seductive of lights, the light of hope. And that hope was synonymous with her. Changing Star slowly descended from the steps, her words echoing from the marble walls of the throne room. Follow me, and I will lead you out of this hell. Follow me, and I will show you the path back to your homes. But make no mistake. She stopped and remained silent for a few long moments. When she spoke again, her voice sounded calmer, colder, heavier. The road ahead will be long and arduous. Not everyone will make it. The weak will die. The strong will die, too. And those who remain won't be the same. But there is one thing I can promise you. Memphis entered the crowd and looked at the people surrounding her with absolute resolve burning in her beautiful eyes. Follow me, and you will never be slaves. Sunny shivered, feeling as though she was speaking to him alone. Everyone in the great hall felt the same way, perhaps. Staring directly into their souls, Changing Star spoke. Slaves to your fear, slaves to your fate, slaves to the nightmare spell. Come with me, and whether you live or die, you will do so humans, not cowering beasts. She closed her eyes and exhaled, then looked down. Finally, she said, the passion disappearing from her voice. But I will not force anyone to follow me, ever. Whether you come with me or stay, it is your choice. There is no shame in staying. Those who do not wish to go may leave this hall right now. Sunny looked at the sleepers, trying to guess what their reaction would be. People were staring at each other, doubt and fear written on their faces. Not everyone was enthralled by Changing Star. Not everyone was brave and strong. Not everyone was ready to die fighting. But in the end, not a single one of them left. Nephi sighed and slowly turned her head west, as though trying to pierce the stone of the castle walls with her gaze. After a while, she said, Good. I am glad. Then it's decided. She turned to face them, furious white flames illuminating her pale face. Then the day after tomorrow, we will leave the bright castle. The day after tomorrow, we march on the Crimson Spire. Chapter 313 Starlight Shard. On the last day they would spend in the Dark City, Nephice led a small group of her most powerful warriors on one last hunt. The members of her cohort were all following behind her. Sunny, who stubbornly refused to accept his status as one of them, walked apart from the group, idly looking around and observing the ruins. Gemma and Seishin were also with them, as well as 10 or so of the most experienced hunters, some of them formerly from the host, some formerly from the outer settlement. There was no difference between the two anymore. All of them were simply Changing Star's people now. As they were walking, Gemma approached Sunny and glanced at him with curiosity. After Tessai had fallen to Nef's blade, the tall man seemed to have found some measure of peace. Somewhere deep in his eyes, however, there always was a hint of sorrow. Sunny stared at him and raised an eyebrow. What? The hunter smiled slightly and asked in a friendly tone. You're Sunless, right? Sunny shrugged. Yeah, that's me. Gemma silently measured him and then asked with interest. I've heard that you lived for months alone in the city. Is that true? Makes sense. The tall man was perhaps the most experienced hunter on the Forgotten Shore. He had survived countless battles on the streets of the cursed city. It was natural for him to be curious about this matter. Sunny gave him a nod.
Sure.
A little over 3 months, I guess. Gemma rubbed his chin, then asked bluntly, How did you survive? Sunny grinned. How had he managed that, indeed? Lots of hiding, lots of killing. a modicum of madness, and a little bit of luck. Gemma stared at him for a bit, then chuckled. Sound about right, I guess. After a while, he glanced forward at Changing Star and asked in a curious tone, Do you know what we're going to hunt today? Sunny looked at him with surprise. She didn't tell you? The tall man hesitated, then shook his head.
She did.
I'm just not sure that I believe it. Sunny smiled and looked away. Let me guess. Your first thought was that she had lost her mind. What can I say? Get used to that feeling. After a few moments of silence, Gemma sighed. But how can we kill it? Poor guy. Sunny glanced at him, lingered for a bit, and then said, If my guess is correct, you know more about it than I do. And just like that, their conversation ended. By the middle of the day, they reached the eastern edges of the city and climbed the imposing monolith of the Great Wall. Standing on top of it, they saw the colossal crater and the headless statue that stood not too far away, its one remaining hand thrust toward the skies. Their prey was hiding in a vast underground chamber beneath that statue. Today, they were going to hunt the Lord of the Dead. At the base of the statue, the second arm of the priestess lay in the mud. Thousands of years ago, it had broken off and fallen, crashing through the dome of the underground chamber. Now, there was a chasm in the ground that led into the lair of the Lord of the Dead. Many months ago, Sunny and the rest had used that breach to escape from the catacombs. Now, they were going to use it to descend into that darkness. Instead, the ghastly master of the catacombs waited for them below. Sunny wasn't really surprised that Nephice had chosen to return to this place. After all, the mountainous abomination was most likely guarding the last of the 7 shard memories. However, he was really curious about how exactly she was planning to kill it. Once everyone gathered around the hole in the mud, Changing Star glanced at him and said, Sunny, can your shadow take a look at the burial chamber? With a shrug, he sent the shadow into the breach. It slid into the mud and entered the dark hole, then hid in the palm of the giant stone hand and cautiously looked down. The mountain of human bones was still there, in the middle of the vast circular chamber. However, it looked very different from how it had been before. Countless green vines were growing from the massive bones, some of them comparatively thin, others as thick as a human body. They weren't growing just between the ancient remains. The vines were bursting through the bones, too, almost as if feeding on them. The Lord of the Dead seemed weaker, more brittle, as though it was sick, sapped of its strength, and infected by a terrible parasite. Sunny commanded his shadow to look closer and finally noticed the thing that he had expected to see. A small wooden box lay on the floor of the underground chamber, open and empty. The exact same box Nephice had mysteriously entrusted to Castor as soon as they were back in the Dark City. From the words of the outer settlement hunter, that box had appeared on his pillow with a small note. That note had been written by Changing Star's spy, Seishin. And the contents of the box had been created for her by Keto, who is now dead. Keto had been the leader of the artisans. Her aspect ability allowed her to control and alter plants. This bone-eating vine, as it turned out, was her last creation and final masterpiece. Turning to Nephice, Sunny hesitated for a moment and then spoke, his words causing a subtle reaction in Gemma. The tyrant is heavily infected by Keto's vine. It seems to be considerably weakened. Changing Star nodded and remained silent for a few moments. Then she said, Once we enter the chamber, the Lord of the Dead will attack us. Now that its power is reduced, and with the help of the Dawn Shard, we should be able to survive the onslaught. We should also be able to wound and eventually kill it. Looking at the faces of everyone gathered in the shadow of the headless statue, she nodded and headed toward the breach. Let's go. Soon, Sunny was trying to survive the fury of the Lord of the Dead once again. But this time, it was not as hard as it had been before. He had become stronger, and the horrible creature had become weaker. His memories were augmented by the Crown of Dawn, and Saint was now a demon. There were also more humans resisting the tyrant today. That was not to say that the battle wasn't harrowing and perilous. In fact, it was utterly lethal. The humans fighting the monumental nightmare creature were surrounding it, dodging the long limbs of the tyrant and trying to attack it when an opportunity presented itself. Kai was zipping in the air, providing support and bringing the wounded away from the fight. They were only alive because the attacks of the Lord of the Dead were now slower and less devastating than before. With some preparation, both Effie and Saint could withstand one or two with the help of their shields. Castor was able to deliver several cuts to it with its ghostly blade, while Seishin had broken one limb completely with her graceful warhammer. Each strike of the sunlight shard seemed to bring immense pain to the Lord of the Dead. But nothing hurt it more, of course, than the incandescent blade of Changing Star. Together, they dealt more and more damage to the terrible creature, despite the fact that many of them were now either severely wounded or dead. The tyrant was being consumed from within by the green vines, and broken from the outside by their weapons. And then, after a long and arduous battle, a huge layer of bones fell from the body of the Lord of the Dead, revealing its inner core. That core, which was made of human skulls and coagulated blood, was absolutely terrifying, malignant, and abhorrent. In its death, the shape of a fat white maggot could be seen, curled into a ball. At that moment, Effie suddenly stepped forward, twisted her body, and threw the dusk shard as a discus with a deafening cry. The shield that was said to contain the weight of the heavens streaked through the air with terrible speed and hit the inner core of the tyrant, crushing through it like a wrecking ball. It cut the maggot in half and exited the body of the Lord of the Dead from the other side in a torrent of broken bones. Then it fell to the ground, shattering the stone floor of the chamber and sending a net of cracks running through it from the point of impact. The mountain of bones froze, and they shuddered. And then it crumbled. Everyone stared at Effie, shocked, hope burning in their eyes. On her face, there was a dark, mournful expression. Belatedly, Sunny remembered that the members of the original cohort that the boisterous huntress had belonged to all perished here, killed either by the undead army or the Lord of the Dead itself. A few moments later, Effie sighed and turned her face away, hiding it from everyone. Then, she raised a hand and made it into a fist. That was her letting them know that she had received a memory from the kill. A shard memory. The last one there was. Chapter 314. Leaving the Dark City. After everything was done, and Nephice used her flames to heal those who survived, they returned to the city, through the catacombs. Perhaps she wished to eviscerate the army of undead monsters that were now left without the tyrant to bring them back to life. But in the end, they were met with nothing but silence. The horde of ferocious skeletons that had once almost cost Sunny and the rest of the cohort their lives was no more. The dark tunnels stretching beneath the ruins were littered with piles of bones, which were slowly turning into dust. It seemed as though the moment the Lord of the Dead had been destroyed, its servants had perished, too. After a while, the group of humans emerged from the collapsed tower of the lighthouse and continued on its way back to the bright castle. They were going to spend their last night there before leaving the dark city behind. In a small room in the depths of the ancient citadel, 7 people gathered around a table. They were Sunny, Nephice, Cassie, Castor, Effie, Kai, and Seishin. Beyond the walls of the castle, the absolute darkness of the night had devoured the world. Nightmare creatures were prowling the cursed ruins, and somewhere far away, black waves were crashing against the indomitable granite surface of the city wall. Inside, the cold light of a memory lantern illuminated their faces. Strangely, everyone was silent, as though not sure what to say. Finally, Sunny broke the silence by yawning loudly. "Shall we get on with this? Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and some of us need their beauty sleep." He threw a sideways glance at Kai, thought for a bit, and then added, "Actually, every day after today is going to be a long one. So, let's just do it." Nephi stared at him for a few moments, then echoed his words. "Do it." With that, they summoned their memories. An austere tachi and a ghostly stiletto appeared in Sunny's hands. A graceful warhammer with a narrow beak appeared in Seishin's. Effie summoned her beautiful bronze spear and a heavy round shield. Finally, a simple band of metal decorated with a single gem weaved itself from light and rested gently on Changing Star's head. They were the shard memories. Dawn, zenith, dusk, midnight, sunlight, moonlight. and starlight. The last memory was a short, flowing white cloak that draped itself around Effie's shoulders. This was the shard she had received after slaying the Lord of the Dead. For a few moments, no one moved. Then Effie said, "So, what now?" Nephi's titled her head a little, then frowned. Finally, after some time passed, she said,
Come closer.
When they did, something unexpected happened. Sunny felt the hilts of his weapons suddenly growing hotter, and soon, both Midnight and Moonlight Shard began emanating a ghostly, ethereal light. The same was happening to the other shards. 7 beams of light shot toward the center of the room and collided. Then, they fused with each other, and soon, 7 objects weaved themselves from that light and hovered in the air. They were keys forged out of lustrous metal, with 7 shining stars engraved on their surface. It was the manifestation of the terrible oath that the 7 heroes had given all those thousands of years ago. The keys that were used to seal the curse of the all-consuming darkness underground. Suddenly, the 7 keys turned into streams of light and shot toward each of the 7 people gathered in the room. One beam hit Sunny in the chest and disappeared, absorbed into his core. The voice of the spell resounded in his ears. "You have received an oath key." Sunny shivered. He didn't want anything to do with that morbid oath. But in the end, he had no other choice. Glancing at the rest of the people gathered in the room, Changing Star lingered for a moment, and then said, "We're ready." In the dim light of dawn, the gates of the castle opened for the last time. A long procession of humans walked through them, leaving the ancient citadel that had sheltered them for so long. They walked under the swinging skulls, not paying them any attention. In the aftermath of all the strife, no one had bothered to remove the ghastly things from their chains. It was not like anyone could have forgotten the hundreds of lives lost in the struggle and thousands of deaths before that, even if the skulls were removed. 500 people descended the hill and entered the dark city. A few nightmare creatures tried to attack them and were eviscerated before managing to do any harm. These 500 humans were not a defenseless crowd. They were a battle-hardened army, one comprised of exceptionally powerful sleepers, the most powerful sleepers to ever be born from the human race, perhaps. They moved the ruins, cutting down anything that dared to block their path. Soon, the sleepers approached the western boundary of the Dark City and scaled the ancient wall. There, they stopped and turned, staring at the silhouette of the bright castle in solemn silence. By then, pillars of black smoke were billowing from each of its windows. Soon, the whole castle was enveloped by furious flames, which slowly devoured the white stone of its walls. The magnificent marble cracked and melted, destroyed by the terrible heat. The smaller towers swayed and moved, and then fell into the terrible crucible. The fire was slowly destroying the bright castle, turning it into a molten ruin. In a sense, this was fitting. After all, everything else in the Dark City had been ruined a long, long time ago. Surprisingly, this act of destruction was not Changing Star's idea. She wasn't the one who ordered to burn the bright castle behind them, like a final gesture to hammer it into everyone's souls that there was no way back anymore. Sunny would have expected something like that from Memphis. But no, it was the decision of the people themselves. They wanted to destroy the ancient citadel because they hated it. They hated these ancient, blood-soaked stones only a little bit less than they needed them to survive. And now that they were leaving, they wanted to erase the bright castle from existence. Perhaps if it was gone, the memories of all the darkness that they had witnessed there and were the perpetrators of would disappear with it. After a while, the misshapen, twisted silhouette of the dying fortress was completely hidden by the fire and smoke. Slowly, the silent sleepers turned away from that sight and looked far away into the distance. They were looking west. That was where they were going, to lay siege to the Crimson Spire. One after another, the sleepers descended from the wall and left the Dark City behind. Chapter 3:15 Siege of the Crimson Spire 1. In the cold light of dawn, a gargantuan crimson tower was rising from the labyrinth. From this distance, it looked like a bloodied sword that some primordial titan had thrust into the heavens. The crimson coral streamed from its walls like the blood of gods, spreading out from the base of the spire to devour all of the forgotten shore. The tower itself seemed to stand on an island, which was surrounded from all sides by black water. Even though the sun was already climbing up, this part of the cursed sea did not disappear. Instead, it lingered and moved endlessly, forming a giant whirlpool. Unclear shapes could be seen moving under the surface of the black water, drowning the hearts of humans who dared to approach the spire with dread. Sunny looked up at the endless expanse of the Crimson Tower and paled. Up close, it looked even more ominous, oppressive, and terrifying. He struggled to believe that this cyclopean structure had been built by human hands, let alone that it had been their salvation once a long time ago. Now, the Crimson Spire looked nothing but twisted, eerie, and utterly evil. It emanated a sense of harrowing power that no human could ever hope to challenge. And yet, this was exactly what they were going to do. Turning away, he glanced at the camp of the Dreamer army. For the past week, the 500 of them had traversed the labyrinth to reach this place. Some had perished along the way, but not as many as he had expected. For that short journey, luck had been on their side. In these days, they had slaughtered countless nightmare creatures and somehow managed to avoid attracting the wrath of the dwellers of the deep. They had seen the headless statue of the Lord that stood halfway between the Dark City and the Crimson Spire, and many other wondrous and terrible things. And now, they had almost reached their goal. People were busy preparing for the battle. The dread they had felt at dawn, after looking at the Crimson Spire, which was now so close, turned into grim determination and resolve. Everyone was making final preparations. Some were checking their armor and weapons for the last time. Some were hurriedly building makeshift fortifications. Some were praying, begging the dead gods to save their lives. Truth be told, Sunny was the only person who appeared to be idle. Well, what did they expect? Nephi still had not told him what exactly his role in the battle was going to be. Not that he was obligated to listen. Of course. With a sigh, he turned to the other members of the cohort, who were gathered around a fire, discussing the plan of the battle for the 100th time. Everyone seemed uncharacteristically somber today. One after another, they left to join in the preparations. Soon, Changing Star was the only one left. With a bit of reluctance, Sunny approached her and sat down, staring at the fire. After a while, he said, "This is very strange, don't you think?" She glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. Nephi's had changed a lot since the first time they met, but also remained exactly the same. She was still calm and confident, with ivory skin and beautiful silver hair. She was still strong and full of conviction. It's just that her eyes seemed a bit hollow these days. "What is?" Sunny shrugged. "Just all of it. If someone described this scene to me a year ago, I would have been really perplexed. And yet, here we are." He lingered for a bit, and then added, "We've come very far. The three of us." Both of them glanced at Cassie, who was busy explaining something to the artisan representatives. Her delicate hand rested on the hilt of the quiet dancer. After a while, Nephi nodded.
"Yes.
And now we just need to make one last step." Both of them remained silent for a bit, thinking about how this final step was going to be the hardest yet. Incomparably so. Then, Sunny sighed. "So, what do you want me to do? From how you kept avoiding the subject for these past days, I'm guessing that it's not something trivial." Changing Star smiled, then looked at him with white sparks dancing in her eyes. "A really small thing, really." Then, she turned to face the Crimson Spire, hesitated for a while, and then suddenly said, "Give me your hand." When Sunny did, something traveled through her cool skin into a shadow core. He summoned the runes and looked at them, already knowing what he was going to see. And there it was, listed among his memories. Oath Key 7. Somehow, she had gathered the remaining 6 keys from the rest. And now, she was entrusting them to Sunny. Still looking at the Cyclopean Tower, Nephi said, "I want you to destroy the Dark Sea. Or banish it, at least." Sunny grinned. A really small thing indeed. Very soon, the sun rose higher, and the dark whirlpool surrounding the Crimson Spire became a little smaller. Several bridges of red coral rose from its depths, connecting the island to the rest of the forgotten shore. And out there on the island, countless silhouettes suddenly began to move, crawling out of the crimson mounds. They were the nightmare creatures guarding the cursed tower. All kinds of horrors were among them. There were members of the Carapace Legion, scavengers, centurions, and demons. There were colonies of carnivorous worms, giant centipedes that secreted corrosive oil, and eerie vines that crawled on the ground like snakes. There were creatures that looked like black masses of rotten bones and creatures that looked like humanoids made of rock, with terrible maws full of jagged fangs. There were swarms of translucent insects that devoured everything in their path, and massive spiders clad in iron armor. There were beasts that could shoot deadly bone spears from their bodies and beasts that could turn their prey to stone with their gaze. There were corpses with red flowers growing from the holes in their flesh and giant abominations that resembled praying mantises, if those were made of glass and blood-red clay. And many more that Sunny had never seen, fought, or could describe. All of them moved together in strange harmony, devoid of the usual territorial aggression that forced the nightmare creatures of different tribes to fight each other. They were subjugated by the Crimson Terror and now served to guard the spire. Like a terrible wave, the horde of monsters rolled over the bridges of crimson coral and flowed toward the human army. From his position at the back of it, Sunny could clearly see the bodies of those standing in the front line tremble and take an involuntary step back. Someone even dropped their weapon. A moment later, Effie's loud voice rolled over the rows of sleepers. "Stand your ground, wretches. If anyone runs, I'll kill you myself." Strangely, her irritated shout calmed down the fear in their hearts. A moment later, however, it was drowned in the cacophony of the approaching horde. The battle for the Crimson Spire had begun. Chapter 3:16 Siege of the Crimson Spire 2. On the outskirts of the Crimson Spire, there were no more passages and tunnels in the coral. It was just a solid red mass, an unbroken surface of the strange living substance that had devoured the forgotten shore thousands of years ago. Currently, Effie was standing on that surface. Several hundred people were standing beside her, staring at the approaching wave of nightmare creatures with horror and shock. All of them knew what was going to happen once they reached the spire, but even then, the sight of it was terrifying. She was at the center of the front row of these frightened people, supposedly in command of them. With her tall stature and lean, powerful figure, Effie stood out among the rest of the sleepers. Her archaic armor glistened in the light of the rising sun, and on her shoulder, there was a flowing white cloak weaved from starlight. She held Zenith in one hand and Dusk in the other. Effie seemed like a bastion of strength and resolve in the sea of fear. A mythical hero who had stepped into the mortal realm from an ancient legend. But really, she was scared ***. Looking at the rolling horde of abominable horrors with a grim expression, the huntress lowered her head a little and summoned the helm of her armor, which was crowned with a tall crest of blue horsehair, and thought, "Fuck me sideways, fuck, fuck, fuck." All around her, people were trembling. Some fool dropped his weapon and took a few steps back, as if considering running away. Even though she was currently seriously thinking of doing the same, Effie snarled and bellowed, "Stand your ground, wretches. If anyone runs, I'll kill you myself." What was the point of running anyway? There was nowhere to run. If they were going to die, they might as well die like humans. Just like Princess had said. She was somewhat full of ***T, but also never wrong. "Get ready, bastards." Gripping her spear, Effie cast a sideways glance at the two men standing beside her. One of them was Castor, and the other one was Gemma. Who would have thought that one day she and the leader of Gunlog's hunters were going to fight side by side? Weirdly, the presence of her past enemy was now extremely reassuring. However, even on his face, there were hints of fear. The only person who could have stayed nonchalant in this situation was probably Doofus. That pale miscreant was either too crazy or too stupid, or both, to be scared of anything. But he was currently nowhere to be seen. Effie sort of missed the tiny menace. But Sunny was probably either hiding someplace dark or doing something too insane to be entrusted to anyone else. In any case, she wished him luck. She wished herself luck, too. Looking at the approaching horde of monsters, Effie waited for a few seconds and then screamed. First mark. Her shout was repeated by Seishin, who commanded the second line, and reached Knight somewhere in the third. The plan of the battle was really simple. The first line had to hold off the monsters, changing places with the second once they grew tired. Meanwhile, the third was in charge of eviscerating as many creatures as they could. But first, they had to withstand the initial charge. Nothing was more important than breaking the momentum of the attacking horde. Somewhere behind her, the enchanting voice of their resident idol gave the command to fire the siege engines. These monstrous machines were constructed by the artisans and were supposed to be able to pierce the armor of the most heavily protected nightmare creatures. As long as they were not fallen, of course. A strange and melodic sound reached her ears, and a fraction of a second later, 6 heavy metal spears, each at least 2 meters long, flew above their heads with incredible speed. They streaked through the air and collided with the front of the horde, sending bits of chitin and streams of blood to the ground. She saw one of them behead a giant crab-like creature, the other pierce right through a blood-red mantis and skewer several monsters behind it. But the wave of horrors did not slow down one bit. There were just so many of them. Feeling a shiver run through her body, Effie gritted her teeth, then shouted, "Second mark." Almost immediately, a rain of arrows fell on the monsters, wounding many and killing a few. There were many other projectiles mixed in with the arrows. Some sleepers used slings, crossbows, or more exotic projectile weapons. Some used their aspect abilities, which allowed them to create all sorts of sorceress attacks, like flying blades made of wind, fire, and ice. Some could even create bombs filled with soul essence, which detonated in the midst of advancing horrors and ripped many apart. But still, no reaction. The monsters only seemed to become more frenzied, the fury, madness, and bloodlust in their eyes flashing even brighter. The second rain of arrows fell, and shortly after, 6 more spears shot from makeshift ballistae crashed into the horde. By then, the nightmare creatures were already too close to the front line of humans to change anything. Making a step forward, Effie strained her muscles and threw the zenith shard into the approaching mass of abominations. The beautiful bronze spear shattered the steel carapace of an especially tall creature and pierced its heart. How could it not kill, empowered by the miraculous enchantment of the Crown of Dawn? All of their weapons and all of their armor were currently being fed raw power by Changing Star. All around the steel demon, numerous abominations fell, killed in a similar fashion by the memories thrown by the other sleepers. Summoning the spear back, Effie watched as the first row of nightmare creatures fell into a deep ditch that the artisans created just an hour earlier. Those moving behind them simply stepped on the bodies of their fellow abominations and continued moving forward. But finally, the speed of the horde was diminished, if only by a little. "Damn this. Brace." That's all she had time to yell before the wave of monsters crashed into the line of humans. Then, the world was consumed by nothing but madness, havoc, and death. Chapter 3:17 Siege of the Crimson Spire 3. Putting her weight behind the dusk shard, Effie leaned into the shield and gritted her teeth. A moment later, a monstrous blow landed on it, strong enough to crush stone into dust. But unlike Sunny's marvelous echo, she was not made out of stone. Instead, Effie was made out of something far more resilient.
Arg.
Pushing with all her strength, she felt the shockwave of the impact run through her entire body and then dissipate into the ground. Her bones groaned but held together. Despite the terrible pressure, she held. 2. A moment later, Effie growled and pushed even harder, throwing the carapace centurion that had crashed into her a couple of centimeters back. Simultaneously, her spear shot from behind the shield and pierced the black chitin, sinking deep into the flesh of the monster. She twisted it and severed the creature's spine, then slammed her shoulder into the dusk shard, sending the massive corpse flying off the bronze blade. Just in time. A second later, and the tall bastard would have skewered her with one of its scythes from above. But as soon as the centurion fell to the ground, another abomination was already taking its place, with a terrible salivating maw and furious eyes that burned with madness. Curse it all! All around Effie, The bodies of humans and nightmare creatures were entangled into an undulating, bleeding, roaring mess. Claws and steel weapons rose and fell, sending streams of blood, splinters of bone, and chunks of flesh to the ground. Screams of fear, pain, and fury mixed with the indescribable howling of the nightmare horde into a cacophonous litany of death. In this split second, she noticed one of her fellow hunters throwing the body of an iron spider that had jumped onto him back with a thunderous strike of his shield, a stone golem biting into someone's head with its terrible jagged fangs, a giant centipede wrapping its long segmented body around a screaming human and sinking its 100 legs into his melting armor. Then, she had no more time to stare. Hold, you misbegotten waifs. Taking a step forward, she dodged a harrowing slash of a 3-meter-tall mantis-like creature's scythe and brought the edge of her shield on the leg of the abominable thing. The thin limb practically exploded, sending the monster crashing down, right on the blade of her spear, which flew upward and turned the head of the mantis into a red smudge. Before the creature even fell to the ground, Effie had already spun, receiving a rain of blows on her heavy shield. Her spear lashed out from behind it, piercing the body of the attacker through the heart. Blood flower. Effie held her breath and kicked the rotting primate in the chest, sending it flying back before too much of the damned pollen escaped the wound. The body of the blood flower host collided with another monster and exploded into bloody chunks from the force of the impact. You have slain. Noticing a shadow move to her right, Effie turned and thrust her spear forward. But at the last moment, she pulled it back. The point of the bronze blade stopped just a few centimeters away from another human's face. For a fraction of a second, they stared at each other. Effie with confusion, the vaguely familiar young man with belated fear. Then, a massive shadow moved behind him, and the youth's head suddenly separated from his shoulders in a stream of blood, cut off cleanly with one slash of a metal demon's blade. D-damn. Effie looked up at the terrible creature. But before she had time to react, something crashed into her from the side, sending a wave of pain through her body. With a grunt, she slid on the bloodied coral and twisted her torso to put Dusk Shard between herself and the attacker. A quick glance let Effie know that her armor was still intact, even if just barely. The point of impact was covered with seething acid, which was biting into the metal, trying to burn through it. Thanks to the enhancement of the Dawn Shard, however, the breastplate remained unscathed. She shifted her weight, preparing to deflect the next attack of the giant centipede. Before Effie could, though, something heavy landed on her back, trying to sink its teeth into her neck. She felt drops of blood streaming to her chest. A furious growl escaped from her mouth. Throwing the Zenith Shard into the maw of the charging centipede and practically severing the body of the creature down its length, she stretched her freed hand back, caught the monster that was trying to bite her head off, and threw it to the ground. The body of the abomination hit with enough force to make the coral crack. Just to make sure that the bastard was dead, she stomped on it with her foot, shattering the head of the damn thing into tiny pieces. But as soon as she did, for more were already around her, their sharp claws and fangs lusting to taste her blood. Bringing the Dusk Shard down on one of them, Effie grinned, then twisted and summoned her spear back. With blood streaming from her wounded neck, she dodged a powerful claw and laughed. Bastards, are you trying to eat me? Ha ha ha, let's see who's gonna eat who, fools. All around her, the first line of the Dreamer army was slowly buckling under the pressure of the nightmare horde. So many of them were already dead, and more were dying every second. Their bodies were torn to pieces and devoured, disappearing into the mass of monsters like morning dew. That sight was so harrowing and chilling that the mind simply refused to process it. And yet, the sleepers of the first line, those who possessed the most powerful combat aspects and the best memories, had achieved their goal. They stopped the devastating wave of abominations in its tracks and tied it down with their blades and their lives. The horde failed to roll over the human army, obliterating it completely without even slowing down. More than that, the massacre was not one-sided. For every human killed, several nightmare creatures were wounded, crushed, and cut to pieces. Arduously, and at a great price, the first line was reforming itself, the survivors of the initial charge rallying around 3 champions. They were Effie, Gemma, and Castor, with each of them turning into a bastion in the sea of monsters and gathering fighters around them. The advance of the horde stalled. Whatever creatures managed to get past were met and eviscerated by the sleepers of the second line, led by Saishin. And throughout all of that, the archers and the siege engines of the third line never stopped firing. Chapter 3:18 Siege of the Crimson Spire 4. Stand your ground, wretches. If anyone runs, I'll kill you myself. Hearing Effie's voice, Kai flinched and forced himself to look away from the terrible visage of the horde of nightmarish abominations. Glancing down, he saw that his hand was shaking and clenched it into a fist. He had to calm himself, somehow, or his aim was going to suffer. That wouldn't do. But honestly, how is a person supposed to not be terrified when a literal sea of nightmare creatures, each stronger and deadlier than anything anyone should ever be forced to face, was approaching them so fast? Kai prided himself on overcoming things like stage fright and social anxiety, as well as getting through many unpalatable situations with grace and elegance, not to mention managing to survive in the Dark City for 3 long years without losing his humanity. But this was just too much. What would Sunny say? Thinking of his prickly, but adorable friend, Kai couldn't help but smile a little. Probably something like, "Oh, a horde of nightmare creatures? Yeah, I met one a few days ago. They all died when I sneezed, though." The strangest part was that he would be telling the truth. If Kai decided to dig deeper, he would discover something in the line of Sunny's sneeze causing a massive avalanche that wiped all the monsters out. Or, more likely, that his sneeze had awakened some ancient, much more terrifying creature, which then proceeded to devour all the monsters before turning its gaze on Sunny himself. That was just how Sunny was. Unpredictable. Strangely, these thoughts succeeded in calming Kai down. He only regretted that the cute scoundrel wasn't close by to reassure him in person. Gazing at the approaching horde, he sighed and gripped his bow tighter. The coral was sloping down in the place where Changing Star had chosen to face the guardians of the spire. Because of that, the position of the third line was higher than the other 2, which would allow them to continue firing long after Effie and the rest had engaged the nightmare creatures in melee. In theory, all around him, those sleepers that had suitable memories or aspect abilities were preparing to shoot, waiting for his command. The surviving artisans and their assistants were busy loading the 6 powerful ballistae they had transported all the way from the Dark City and put together the last night. The sight of the mighty siege engines made Kai sigh wistfully. Maybe they were going to survive this battle after all. First mark. As soon as Effie's shout reached his ears, he turned to the artisans and waved a hand, giving them the signal to fire. A second later, 6 heavy spears flashed through the air and crashed into the wall of monsters. Many of them were eviscerated, but these losses were like a drop of water in the sea of darkness. Kai gritted his teeth. Second mark.
Now.
As his melodic voice rolled over the third line of the Dreamer army, he drew his bow and took aim. Back in the real world, archery was Kai's favorite hobby. Not the practical skill of shooting a bow, which was taught to many in school, but the ancient practice known as Kyudo, which was more of a meditative ritual than a real battle art. Its orderly nature, tranquil philosophy, and repetitive motions appealed to something deep inside him. The more stressed Kai was, the more he practiced. Who knew that one day he would be relying on his marksmanship to survive? Not that aiming at a literal horde of monsters was hard. He didn't have to worry about missing a shot with the blood arrow, at least. Letting go of the string, Kai watched as the black arrow streaked through the air and bit deep into the body of a tall carapace demon. Its bone tip pierced the metal armor of the terrible creature with ease. Not only was it of the ascended rank itself, it was also enhanced by Lady Nephice. Very few creatures could resist his attacks. Keep firing. Kill as many as you can. The demon swayed, then fell to the ground. Kai felt the weakness that overtook him every time he summoned the morbid memory dissipate and called upon the blood arrow again. However, he didn't get to take his second shot before the wave of abominations crashed into the line of sleepers. For a second, Kai was stunned by the harrowing sight. The scale of the massacre that was happening below him was just too vast to comprehend. His heart was instantly constricted, full of worry for Effie and all the other people he knew. With a desperate grimace contorting his face, Kai aimed and shot again. And then he did so again and again and again. Everyone around him was doing everything in their power to kill as many nightmare creatures as they could. Arrows, magical projectiles, and heavy lances launched by the ballistae rained on the ghastly horde, reaping countless lives. But it was not enough, not nearly enough. Seeing so many people be torn to pieces and devoured while trying to protect him and the other archers, Kai couldn't help but wish that he could do more. If only I could fly up and get a better shot, if only I could get closer. But he couldn't. While others lost themselves in the battle completely, Kai had to keep a cool head. After all, he was responsible for the third line of the Dreamer Army. The lives of all these young men and women depended on him. That was why he kept his eyes on the merciless gray sky. Just a few meters above them, almost invisible in the bright light of dawn, a vast net made out of sharp iron wire was drawn above the battlefield. The wire for this net was collected in the labyrinth from those areas where iron spiders were known to nest and fashioned into the aerial barrier by the artisans. It was meant to protect them from the terrifying creatures that could fall at any moment from the skies. After all, the Crimson Spire did not only have a terror and a horde of guardians. It also had its messengers. Chapter 319 Siege of the Crimson Spire 5. Draw your bows. Take aim. Endure. Kai's words were meant to keep the morale of his troops more than they were meant to serve as actual instructions. To tell the truth, he did not have to do much, at least not yet. There were no such things as coordinated volleys when it came to archers. Everyone just had to send one arrow after another into the seething mass of nightmare creatures, as fast as they could. He had to do the same, too. On the ground near him, several quivers full of arrows waited for their turn. Kai was shooting without a respite, alternating between using the blood arrow and these mundane ones. It took time for the ghastly memory to return to his hands, so he had to use something else in between. A good archer had to be able to fire 12 times in a minute. An excellent one twice that. Gritting his teeth, Kai drew his bow, took aim, held his breath, and fired. Every movement had to be efficient, quick, and precise. As soon as one shot was done, another one immediately started. Draw, aim, release. Draw, aim, release. Repeat, and repeat, and repeat. In these moments, he had become less of a human and more of a methodical battle machine that ran on all cylinders without stopping even for a moment. He put an arrow in the eye of a terrible abomination that looked like a giant snake made of seaweed and rotting flesh. Another pierced the chest of a massive bestial primate and impaled him on the carapace of a mantis-like creature. The third bit into the neck of the mantis and greedily drank its tainted blood, causing the monster to stumble and fall. Kai felt like he was drowning. Back in the waking world, archers were always portrayed as nimble, graceful warriors, someone who excelled in agility and speed as opposed to brute strength and physical might. They were beautiful maidens, elegant youths, and cunning rogues. Maybe that was why he had been attracted to bowmanship to begin with. The reality, however, couldn't be further from the truth. It took a lot of strength to pull the string of a combat bow. The draw weight of a good bow was as much as 50 kilograms, on average. I went times the weight of a sword, and memory bows like his were much more monstrous. They were never meant for mundane humans, so pulling that string every few seconds burned through his stamina in mere minutes. Very soon, Kai's muscles screamed in pain, and his lungs seemed to be on fire. But he couldn't stop, he had to keep shooting no matter what. Keep at it. Draw, aim, endure. How could he allow this insignificant pain, this unearned exhaustion to slow him down when out there, below, so many humans were dying in agony to keep the enemy away from the line of archers? Letting loose another arrow, Kai drew in a hoarse breath and glanced up, almost out of habit. However, this time, his gaze lingered on the indifferent gray skies. Then his eyes widened. At some point, 5 black dots appeared high above the battlefield, flying in an eerily perfect circle above it. A cold chill ran down Kai's back. Messengers? 5 fallen monsters were observing the massacre that was happening below them with vile indifference. Even though he could not see their harrowing shapes too well, Kai could somehow feel their gaze. Why aren't they attacking? As if to answer his question, a smaller appeared from the clouds and fell down through the circle created by the messengers. And then another, and another. Just a second later, countless nightmare creatures poured from the gray skies and dove down, swiftly approaching the ground. There were so many of them that their mass resembled a swirling black column of a colossal tornado. Kai trembled. His face paled. However, he did not allow fear to prevent him from fulfilling his duty. Skyward squads. Aim high. At this point, about half of the sleepers in the third line were supposed to switch their attention and repel the aerial threat. However, engrossed in the battle that was happening below, most of them didn't hear or understand his words. Kai grimaced. And then, his clear, enchanting voice rolled over the entire battlefield once again, this time easily piercing through the clangor and havoc of the terrible strife. Skyward. Squads. Aim high. This was the voice he had used to sing the most difficult notes in front of hundreds of thousands of people. Only the dead could not hear it. Brought back to reality by his voice, the archers quickly aimed at the sky. Just in time, Kai let the blood arrow loose, then saw it fly upward and hit one of the winged abominations in the chest. The monster convulsed and dropped vertically down, hitting the sharp wires of the iron net with a sickening sound. A tremor ran through the entire net, and drops of black blood fell to the ground. Stretching his hand to grab a mundane arrow, Kai had a moment to take in the sight of the descending swarm. For a moment, his heart was squeezed by despair. There were so many of the flying nightmare creatures that it was impossible to count them all. Among the swarm of horrors, there were the giant locusts he had fought before, massive abominations with hungry maws and bat-like wings, repulsive birds with fleshy tentacles growing from beneath their pale feathers, and many more. Horrors he had never seen and could have never imagined. And above them, 5 black dots continued to circle in the sky. Putting the arrow on the string of his bow, Kai banished fear and doubt from his heart and drew it. Then, he aimed at the closest of the abominations and willed it to die. A moment later, his arrow hit the creature right in the eye. Most of the archers around him had already switched their targets. Only the siege engine crews and those with abilities and memories unsuitable for firing upward continued to pelt the nightmare horde with deadly projectiles. The quickest of the descending monsters were eviscerated, and soon, a rain of corpses fell on the iron net. But a few lucky ones had avoided the arrows and dove down to devour the humans who stood on the ground. Kai held his breath when the first of them hit the iron wires at full speed. What if the net broke? But it did not, at least for now. The artisans had done their job well. Instead, the creature was instantly sliced apart, its body disintegrating into a rain of blood and strangely symmetrical chunks of flesh. The sight of it was morbidly fascinating. Thank gods. Reaching for another arrow, Kai found nothing but emptiness. Looking down in confusion, he saw that his quivers were empty. Have I used so many? Before he had time to process that thought, however, someone had already thrown 2 fresh quivers on the ground in front of him. Picking up an arrow with aching fingers, Kai inhaled through his teeth and raised his bow. Draw aim. Endure. Chapter 320 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 6. Draw aim. Endure. Just as Knight shouted these words, Aiko tripped and fell. The bundle of arrows she was carrying in her arms scattered on the ground. Ouch! Picking herself up from the coral, she hurriedly gathered the arrows and dashed to the nearest archer, then placed them near his feet. In this battle, the role of people like her, those who were too weak to fight and did not possess a useful aspect, was simultaneously the most simple and the most chaotic. They were charged with supplying the sleepers participating in the battle with everything they needed, be it arrows, crossbow bolts, stones for their slings, or anything else. There were several teams of runners doing different things. Initially, she was supposed to help carry the wounded from the first and second lines to the makeshift hospital at the back of the formation. A few people with aspect abilities having to do with healing waited, ready to help. Her friend Stev was one of them. But as it turned out, there weren't a lot of wounded in this battle. Most simply died on the spot. So she was left with nothing to do and ended up here, helping to supply the archers. She had just brought 2 quivers tonight and was on her way. Wait, how crazy was that? Trying to catch her breath, Aiko glanced around and shivered. Crazy, this is crazy. The scene in front of her was just too bizarre to be true. Several hundred sleepers were besieged by a horde of nightmare creatures on the ground, with another falling on them from above. All that in front of an ugly, endless tower of crimson coral. Surely she was dreaming. Of course you are. This is the dream realm. You dimwit. And yet, the weirdest thing of all was that she was stuck in all this craziness with none other than Night from Nightingale, the breathtakingly beautiful idol whose posters hung on the walls of most girls her age back home. Despite the fact that the two of them had known each other for more than a year and were even on friendly terms, this fact was the one that pushed the surrealism of the situation over the edge. This was exactly the kind of weird dream a teenage girl like her would have. Just as she thought about that, someone fell to the ground a few meters away from her. Turning her head to the sound of a muffled curse, Aiko saw Stev and another sleeper carrying a crude stretcher. On it was a young woman, covered in blood and pale as a ghost, her leather armor torn apart and on the verge of dissipating. A moment before, Stev's partner had tumbled down. It appeared as though he was wounded himself, albeit not too seriously. Running up to them, Aiko took over and helped the ample giant keep the stretcher even. Carrying that weight with her tiny body was not easy, but she gritted her teeth and persevered. Together, they hurried to the back of the formation. On the way, they had to run past the desperate archers and the exhausted crews of the siege engines, who were slowly but surely running out of the massive lances to hurl at the rampaging horde. From the look of it, things weren't going well for the Dreamer army. Down below, the first line was in the process of being completely eviscerated. 3 islands of resistance still persisted in the sea of monsters, but Aiko didn't know how much longer those poor people would be able to hold. The second line was now entangled with the nightmare creatures, too. The initial plan had been for these 2 forces to switch positions to give the exhausted warriors time to rest, but now it was never going to happen. Up above, more and more corpses were falling on the invisible iron net. Despite that, the number of flying abominations did not seem to diminish at all. The metal wires were groaning, having to carry more and more weight. Are we all going to die? Feeling cold dread spread through her body, Aiko trembled and involuntarily turned her head to the tallest point in the Dreamer army camp. There, on a protruding mound of crimson coral, she saw 3 figures. One was Saint Nephis herself. The other was her blind oracle. And the third... Wait, what is that guy doing there? The third person was none other than Sunny, the strange young man who had gotten her into this mess to begin with. After joining the Changing Stars faction, Aiko quickly learned who the important people were and what positions they held in the Bright Ladies cohort. Everyone's role was clear and easy to understand. Except for Sunny. What role that pale youth played was entirely unclear. People seemed to consider him a member of Lady Nephis' cohort, but Sunny himself always insisted that he was not. He was thought to be a competent fighter, but actually no one had really seen him fight. Most people just knew him for his tendency to keep to himself, ridiculous bragging, and carefree attitude. They simultaneously respected him for being Changing Star Scout and considered him mostly harmless. However, Aiko did not think that Sunny was harmless. She had seen him appear from the shadows and kill the guard who had been strangling her with one relaxed move, as though getting rid of an insect. In her mind, Sunny was very mysterious. He was a wild card. Seeing him with Lady Nephis now, she suddenly felt a tiny bit of hope. Maybe Changing Star had a plan. Maybe they were going to survive after all.
Aiko.
Move your short legs faster, will you? Frowning at Stev's remark, she looked at the ground and concentrated on not slowing her giant friend down. Soon, they reached the hospital and placed the stretcher on the makeshift table. Stev dashed to retrieve his tools, but it was too late. The young girl on the stretcher was already dead. Aiko remained motionless for a bit, staring at the ground. After a while, Stev cautiously touched her on the shoulder. "Hey, are you okay, shorty?" She wiped her face, then nodded.
Yeah.
"I'm fine. Gotta run, though. Those arrows aren't going to carry themselves." Stev lingered for a bit, then tried to smile.
All right.
Stay safe." She smiled and nodded again. "Yeah, you stay safe, too." With that, Aiko turned around and ran out of the tent. Outside, the battle was only growing more ferocious. Chapter 3:21 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 7. Sunny stood at the peak of a tall coral mound, observing the battle that raged below. There was a slight frown on his face, but his eyes were calm. The Dreamer army was besieged from two sides. One horde of abominations was slowly devouring its front line, while another had descended on them from above, stalled for now by the vast net of sharp iron wires. It was like a scene from a fever nightmare. Every second, humans were dying, torn apart by the claws and fangs of the harrowing horde of monsters. Their cries and screams fused with the roaring wails of the nightmare creatures into a deafening wave of dissonant noise. That wave washed over the crimson coral, sending a chill running down his spine. Turning away from the blood-soaked visage of the battlefield, Sunny glanced at Nephi's. Changing Star was sitting on the ground. Her face was calm, and her eyes were closed. On her forehead, the gem of the dawn shard burned with furious white light, feeding hundreds upon hundreds of memories with raw power. She appeared to be in the depths of profound meditation, seemingly not affected by the horrible decimation that was happening below them at all. Cassie was standing beside her, looking at the ground. Her hand rested on the hilt of the quiet dancer. The other two echoes of the blind girl had been with the first line of the army during the initial charge. By now, they were already destroyed. Sunny wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. The time for conversations was over. Instead, he faced the Crimson Spire. His gaze lingered on it for a few moments, then slid back to the terrible sight of the slaughter. Straining his eyes, Sunny tried to distinguish the figures of Effie and Kai in the chaotic formation of the Dreamer army. "Don't die just yet, fools." Down below, surrounded by those warriors of the first line that still stubbornly clung to life, Effie had long forgotten about anything else but bloodshed and strife. The scope of the world had narrowed to the suffocating confines of the furious battle, consuming both the past and the future. There was only the present, and the present consisted of nothing but violence and death. And killing, of course. With a mad grin on her bloodied face, she faced one abomination after another, crushing, breaking, and tearing them apart. Her tall, lean body had turned into a lethal battle machine, moving with ferocious speed and devastating power, deadly precision, and murderous will. Both Zenith and Dusk behaved like natural extensions of her limbs, alternating between attack and defense to reap one profane life after another. Her armor had been pierced several times, but she paid it no attention. It didn't matter. All that mattered was to kill as many nightmare creatures as possible, to obliterate as many of the hateful monsters as she could. Their corpses piled up, carpeting the crimson coral with an uninterrupted bleeding mass of broken flesh. After a while, Effie had to start watching her step carefully. Despite that, the number of abominations showed no sign of growing smaller. It was as though the horde was endless and boundless. But she wasn't scared. In fact, Effie was enjoying herself. Oh, this was so exhilarating. Dodging a serrated claw, she lunged forward and crushed the ribcage of an attacking monster with the rim of her shield, then used the remaining momentum to skewer another one on her spear. With no time to retrieve her weapon and turn, she used the shaft of Zenith Shard to deflect a blow from a mighty pincer of a carapace scavenger and kicked the beast viciously, shattering the adamantine shell of its armor. Other sleepers were fighting around her, using the fearsome huntress as an anchor in the sea of death. They were still holding, still breathing. Two other islands of resistance had formed around Gemma and Castor, who were also in the throes of the battle trance. The proud legacy had turned into a whirlwind of ghostly steel, eviscerating any creature that dared to approach him. His movements were so fast that his enemy's blood could not even fall to the ground. As a result, Castor was constantly surrounded by a cloud of red mist. The experienced hunter fought with cunning and skill, sending one abomination after another into the embrace of death. Whatever wounds appeared on Gemma's body were soon gone, not even leaving a trace. Numerous fearsome creatures had been slain by his hand, unable to do the tall man any harm. And yet humans were dying. One after another, they fell, leaving less and warriors to hold back the gluttonous horde. As Effie fought, a sudden thought entered her mind, sending a slight shiver running through her body. Heavy. That damn shield is so heavy. She was growing tired. Kai had lost count of the number of monsters he killed. Because of the constant cycle of losing blood and magically getting it back, he felt slightly lightheaded. Luckily, he had yet to miss a shot maybe, and was able to continue firing. More and more corpses fell on the iron net, their blood flowing on the people below. It was as though they were now fighting in the rain. A red, fetid rain of blood. Blood, blood, blood. No matter where he looked, he saw nothing but blood. He was sick of it. Gritting his teeth, Kai drew his bow once again, aimed between two dead creatures above him, and sent an arrow flying. You have slain and awakened. They were running out of arrows. The siege engines were running out of lances, too. And the damn messengers were still circling high above, not even trying to descend. Why aren't they attacking? Looking down, Kai tried to catch his breath and muttered, "Curses! Why was it so dark?" He couldn't see where his quivers were. Something shifted in his mind, and then he blinked. Looking up again, Kai realized that the entire net was now covered with corpses. There were so many dead nightmare creatures that they formed a macabre carpet that veiled the battlefield from the sun. There wasn't a lot of daylight seeping through the net now, and it was growing darker and darker with each second. His eyes widened, not because of the deep darkness, but because Kai suddenly heard the iron wires groaning under all that weight, almost as if strained too much and on the verge of tearing apart. The protective net was going to break soon. His face paled. Oh no! On the tall mound of crimson coral, Changing Star suddenly opened her eyes and looked at Sunny. It's time. Chapter 322 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 8. Things were turning from dire to desperate for the Dreamer army. The first line was almost gone, and the second was now completely engulfed by the horde of nightmare creatures. Saishin was still standing her ground, but just barely. The archers under Kai's command were doing their best to eviscerate as many monsters as they could, but with their attention split between those on the ground and those diving at the iron net from above, the results weren't as devastating as they had been during the initial stage of the battle. They were running out of arrows and ammunition, too. The siege engines were slowly disintegrating under the pressure of so many consecutive shots. The people were tired, and the iron net itself looked as though it was going to break soon. It was covered with a carpet of dead nightmare creatures, submerging the battlefield into dim twilight. With every minute, that twilight was turning darker and darker. The human formation seemed to be balancing on the very edge of collapse. It was at that moment that Nephice, who had been calmly meditating through all of that, suddenly opened her eyes. In them, two blinding white flames were burning. Her pale face became illuminated by this radiance, like that of a merciless celestial creature. Turning to Sunny, she remained silent for a moment and then said, "It's time."
He sighed.
Indeed, it was time for the two of them to enter the fray and play their roles. As Neph stood up and summoned her sword, he flexed his shoulders and stretched his neck. The midnight shard, however, remained hidden in the depths of the shadow core. Sunny glanced at Cassie, hesitated for a few seconds, and then smiled. "Hey, Cass. I'll see you on the other side, I guess." She lingered for a bit, then nodded slowly and turned away. "Don't die." He sighed. "That's my cue, I guess." Together, he and Nephice walked over to the edge of the coral mound and jumped down, leaving the blind girl standing alone on its top. Softly landing on the ground, Sunny waved to Neph and said in an even tone, "I'll go first. Good luck." With that, He turned in the direction of the battlefield and inhaled deeply. In front of him, the desperately fighting Dreamer army was intertwined with the nightmare horde in the darkness cast by the groaning net of iron wires. The whole battlefield had turned into a realm of blood, death, and shadow. The more corpses piled on the net, the deeper and darker the shadows became. This was Sunny's territory now. Stepping into the darkness, he suddenly became almost invisible. The shadows embraced him as one of their own, hiding his figure and movements. Veiled in their embrace, he steeled his will and dashed toward the battlefield. Moving forward, Sunny ran past the tent of the makeshift hospital where a group of people was supposed to be desperately trying to save those lucky few who had managed to receive a non-lethal wound. Right now, however, the tent was partially toppled and engulfed in chaos. One of the flying nightmare creatures had somehow managed to squeeze under the net and was now wreaking havoc inside of it, its black body pierced by several arrows, but still full of deadly power. Formidable, CM. Sunny moved past it without looking back. Stepping through the deepest, darkest shadows, he ran past the line of siege engines and noticed the small figure of Aiko helping an exhausted artisan load one last spear into position. The steel lance was clearly too heavy for the delicate girl, but she was pushing it up with stubborn determination. Then, he was between the rows of archers. These people were continuing to fire, desperately trying to find clear spots between the numerous corpses piled on top of the trembling iron net. He saw Kai looking around with a lost look on his face. Sunny wanted to stop and reassure his friend, but couldn't. Sliding between these people without being noticed, he left the third line and dashed toward the second. Here, his task of remaining unseen became much harder. The second line had lost almost all pretense of order, but remained unbroken. With the warriors under Effie's command still taking the brunt of the horde and withstanding its pressure, Seishin had managed to prevent any abominations from reaching the archers. At least for now. Dodging the defending humans and the attacking monsters, Sunny entered the crucible of battle. He wasn't here to fight, however. His goal was still ahead. Moving unseen, he evaded several vicious skirmishes. Somewhere along the way, he noticed Seishin herself. The beautiful woman was fighting with darkly fascinating grace. The sunlight shard rose and fell, guided by her slender hand. The amount of power delivered by these strikes, however, was nothing short of terrifying. Every time the war hammer struck, a nightmare creature was broken apart, with bits of chitting, bone, and streams of blood flying into the air. It was still not enough, though. After another blow, a menacing figure of a carapace scavenger suddenly grasped the memory in its powerful pincer and tore it away from Seishin's hand. In the next moment, a subtle change happened to the body of the graceful handmaiden. It seemed as though she grew taller, her limbs elongating, her spine twisting. Her smooth gray skin became like that of a shark, and her eyes rolled back, revealing a second pair of pupils, these ones vertical and surrounded by a sea of red. Seishin's jaw unhinged, revealing several rows of terrible fangs. Dashing forward, she easily broke the carapace of the nightmare creature with her bare fist. A fraction of a second later, her jaws closed on the joint of the pincer, piercing the chitin and tore the entire limb apart. Leaving that disturbing scene behind, Sunny moved into another layer of shadows and ran toward the first line. There, the mass of abominations and surviving humans was almost impenetrable. And yet, he had to pierce it. Drawing in a deep breath, Sunny dove into the sea of nightmare creatures. Moving between the endless horde of monsters like a dancer, he dodged and avoided their chaotically moving bodies, keeping to the shadows. If he was noticed, he was going to be torn apart in mere seconds. If he slowed down, he was going to be crushed and obliterated. Like a shadow, Sunny slid between them. A few times, he had to quickly dash beneath an especially tall abomination or jump over another. For a few seconds, he even ran on top of these horrible monsters, jumping from the shoulder of one to the carapace of another, and then back to the bloodied, slippery ground. On his way, he saw Effie. The huntress had either lost or dismissed her shield and was now spinning her spear and using it to deliver both piercing and slashing attacks, drawing wide arcs in the air with its bronze blade. Her body was covered in blood, and her armor was broken and shattered. But on her face, there was a wide, joyful grin. Leaving it all behind, Sunny moved deeper into the horde of monsters. A few times, he thought that he would be noticed. But in the end, the shadows had kept him safe. And after a while, an eternity, maybe, he finally broke free of the endless mass of nightmare creatures. Now, there was nothing in front of him but the wide expanse of the cursed black water, and the mass of the crimson spire stretching endlessly into the skies. Chapter 323 Siege of the Crimson Spire 9. Sunny froze for a moment, captivated by the all-encompassing expanse of the cyclopean spire that towered above the entire world. Almost at the same moment, the darkness behind him was suddenly annihilated by a blinding explosion of light. The noise of the battle changed, somehow growing even more intense. The howling of the nightmare horde grew louder, but also became slightly muffled, almost anxious. Changing Star had finally joined the fight. A moment later, hundreds of human voices rose in a deafening battle cry, their spirit lifted, their crumbling resolve restored. With Nephites arriving on the battlefield, the balance of the whole battle shifted. The nightmare creatures surged to destroy the radiant figure, only to be obliterated by it. They almost seemed to melt under the furious assault of the incandescent blade, turning into cinder and ash. Neph's arrival brought a moment of relief to the exhausted warriors of the Dreamer army. Instead of using it to catch their breaths and regroup, however, they chose to use this opportunity to launch into a ferocious attack, making the horde shudder and recoil. Sunny was not paying any attention to what was happening behind his back, though. His eyes were locked on the bridge of crimson coral that stretched across the vast whirlpool of black water, creating a path to the island on which the cursed spire stood. On it were countless abominations, each of them pushing, howling, fighting for their turn to taste soft human flesh. However, the harrowing mass of them wasn't endless anymore. He could actually see the tail of the nightmare horde, with the distant half of the bridge being almost empty. Not that it was going to make things easy for him. As soon as Sunny escaped from beneath the iron net, he became illuminated by the bright sunlight, with nowhere else to hide. Completely exposed. The eyes of numerous monsters were already on him, bloodlust and hunger igniting in their depths. If he wanted to use the bridge, he was going to have to cut his way through the undulating mass of nightmare creatures. Saint. Answering his call, the marble demon appeared from the shadows, her ruby eyes burning with cold menace behind the visor of the onyx helmet. The taciturn knight stood silently on the shore of the rushing black water, gazing at the horde of monsters across its dark expanse. Sunny took a few steps back and glanced at the mass of abominations who were already lunging in his direction. Here goes nothing. Dashing forward, he crossed the distance to the saint and jumped. The shadow raised her shield, allowing him to step on it, and then pushed away with all her incredible strength. Simultaneously, Sunny launched himself off this unlikely springboard and shot into the air. The wind whistled in his ears. Soaring above the mass of black water and all the horrors that hid in its depths, he flew toward the crimson spire with terrible speed. The dark wing turned into a blur behind his back, making Sunny weightless, and thus prolonging this state of flight. It was still not nearly enough to reach the island, however. In a few short seconds, he crossed almost half of the wide surface of the dark whirlpool. But then, his momentum slowed, and soon, Sunny started to fall. Thanks to the transparent cloak, he didn't plunge straight down, instead gliding through the air, slowly approaching the seething black water. He was never going to make it, but then he was never planning to. Twisting his body, Sunny hurled the prowling thorn at the crimson coral of the bridge. As soon as the heavy kunai bit into it, he forcefully pulled on the invisible string, changing the direction of his flight. A few seconds later, Sunny landed on the bridge in a roll and jumped to his feet. Behind him, the tail end of the nightmare horde was still oblivious to his presence. In front of him was a clear path to the crimson spire. Dismissing the dark wing and summoning Shadow Saint back into his core, Sunny ran forward without wasting even a moment to look back. Soon, the crimson spire eclipsed the whole sky. It seemed as though the world suddenly made a 90-degree turn, the ground itself becoming vertical instead of horizontal. Even craning his neck, Sunny couldn't see the top of the ominous tower anymore. It was as if the dream realm was like a box, and he had reached one of its walls. The edge of reality itself. Throwing all unnecessary thoughts out of his head, Sunny rushed toward the spire. His goal was almost in sight. 7 severed heads, guarding 7 locks. This was what Cassie had told them a year ago, at the start of this cursed journey. Somewhere at the base of the Crimson Spire, there was a place where one could insert 7 keys into 7 locks to seal the curse of the all-consuming darkness underground once more, thus restoring the oath of the ancient heroes. Shard memories had given Changing S Stars cohort these keys, and now, Sunny held all of them in his soul. He just had to find the locks. And very soon he did. Hidden behind a tall mound of crimson coral, a vast expanse of flat surface led all the way to the walls of the corrupted spire. On it, arranged in a wide semicircle, 7 giant heads stared away from Sunny. Despite the fact that they were facing the other way, he recognized them immediately. These were the stolen heads of the 7 colossal statues that stood across the desolate hell of the Forgotten Shore, ones that had been torn off their shoulders by the Crimson Terror thousands of years ago and then brought here, to lay at the base of its citadel for all eternity. The Lord, the Priestess, the Knight, the Hunter, the Builder, the Slayer, and the Stranger. Their gazes were aimed at the gargantuan gates of the spire. And there, on those gates, the image of 7 shining stars was engraved into the ancient stone. Each star had a dark keyhole in its radiant center. Chapter 324 Siege of the Crimson Spire 10. Summoning Saint to stand side by side with him once again, Sunny glanced at the gates of the spire, grimaced, and jumped down from the mound of coral. I don't like this at all. Out there on the island, it was quiet.
Too quiet.
Even though all the nightmare creatures were now behind him, slowly devouring the Dreamer army, the open space pierced by the gazes of the severed heads of stone colossus was too ominous and foreboding to not spell trouble. But Sunny was done being afraid a long time ago. You fear me instead. Walking forward, he passed between the giant heads and entered the empty space in front of the Cyclopean gates. Feeling as though someone was staring at his back, Sunny shivered and approached the 7 locks. Halfway to the gates, he stopped, hesitated for a moment, and then looked back at stone heads. This was the first time he saw the faces of the 7 heroes. The face of the Lord was noble and dignified, the face of the Priestess, beautiful and gentle. The Slayer was arrogant and cold, her lips twisted in a crooked grin. The Stranger wore a helmet, darkness nesting in the crack of its visor. A people. They were just people. Turning away, Sunny sighed, then shook his head in dejection. I won't judge you for what you have done, but I really that we will be able to do better. With that, he took another step forward and froze. Something had changed on the stretch of land between him and the gates of the Crimson Spire. A cold wind suddenly howled, throwing bits of coral into the air. Those pieces did not fall down. Instead, more and more of the crimson shards flew up, slowly forming into 7 twisted silhouettes. Sunny cursed and outstretched his hand, summoning the midnight shard into it. A few seconds later, 7 golems of crimson coral stood in front of him and Saint, blocking the path to the star sigil. He recognized their shapes. The armored figure of the knight, the slender figure of the slayer, the graceful figure of the priestess. Vile, corrupted facsimiles of the 7 heroes slowly moved, raising their weapons to point at him. Their movements were crude and inhuman but radiated a sense of terrible, profane power. Despite their outward appearance, he felt that these creatures were desecrating the memory of the ancient heroes instead of manifesting it. Sunny grinned and walked toward the coral golems, the blade of his sword pointed downward. 7 of you? Do you really think this will be enough to stop me? His dark eyes gleamed, turning cold and ruthless. Well then, Fools, come and get me. With that, he dashed forward and raised the midnight shard. Before Sunny could strike, however, the stranger appeared in front of him as though out of nowhere and put his round shield in the path of the austere Tachi. Hitting it felt like hitting a mountain. Sunny's eyes widened. Fast. A fraction of a second later, he noticed a beak of a war hammer flying toward his temple with terrible speed. Gritting his teeth, Sunny shifted and blocked it with the blade of the midnight shard. As a painful shockwave rolled through his body, he was thrown backward and slid on the red coral, then groaned and spat a mouthful of blood. Damn it! How are they so strong? Looking up, he saw 7 tall figures approaching him with steady, inevitable malice. Each of the golems was powerful enough to rip an entire cohort of sleepers to pieces. To his side, Saint raised her shield and hit its rim twice with the blade of her sword. Whatever. Let's do this. Back across the whirlpool of black water, the Dreamer army was still furiously resisting the horde of nightmare creatures. By now, all of the monsters had left the coral bridge and descended upon the sleepers, consumed by the mad desire for human flesh. There was no distinction between the first and the second line now. All those still alive were engulfed by the bloody chaos of the slaughter, desperately trying to survive in the midst of absolute chaos. Changing Star was at the center of the terrible bloodshed, shining like a radiant sun. She fought alone because no one else could survive the devastating pressure that the horde exerted in the zealous attempts to extinguish that light. Any human that tried to approach and help her was immediately torn to pieces. Indifferent to everything, Nephice moved like a furious deity, eviscerating one abomination after another. All around her, burning corpses littered the ground, their cursed blood boiling and evaporating into the air. Not only was her presence relieving the pressure from the rest of the sleepers, but they also found strength in it. As long as Changing Star fought for their salvation, how could they give up? As long as her light was there to banish the darkness, how could they lose hope? That was why no monster had managed to break through the remnants of the first 2 lines and reach the archers. Standing on the slippery surface of the crimson coral, Kai gazed at the terrible scene of the massacre below him and then raised his face to the sky. Instead of the sky, however, he saw the dark mass of bleeding corpses carpeting the iron net. His face paled, the light disappearing from his eyes. As the last officer of the Dreamer army to not engage in the melee, he was the only one who could see the bigger picture. He was the only one who knew that the iron net was mere minutes away from breaking. When it did, the mass of sharp iron wires and all the crushing weight of countless dead monsters was going to fall on the remains of the human formation, spelling their doom. Someone had to do something, and that someone was him. Kai blinked, then closed his eyes for a moment. Of course. I am the only one who can. Nothing could stop the collapse of the iron net, but the manner in which it collapsed could be controlled. All they had to do was to cut it at a suitable spot, allowing for the mass of dead nightmare creatures to fall down without burying the fighting humans beneath it. And who could cut the iron wires beside a person capable of flying? The only problem was that once the net was cut, nothing was going to stop the 5 Spire messengers from entering through the breach. He was going to have to lead them away from the battlefield, too.
Yes.
Yes, this is what I have to do. Dismissing his heavy bow, Kai stared at the ground for a few moments. An elegant falcata slowly appeared in his hand. And then, with an expression of dark resolve appearing on his face, he pushed himself off the crimson coral and flew to the strained iron net. Chapter 325 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 11.
Arg.
Damn it. Effie stumbled back and swiped the zenith shard in a wide arc, cutting through the bodies of several nightmare creatures. With her other hand, she took hold of the oversized translucent tick that bit deep into her thigh and tore it away, losing a chunk of flesh in the process. Before the repulsive creature had time to sever her fingers with its sharp mandibles, she crushed it in her fist. Feeling hot blood streaming down her leg, she grimaced and unceremoniously wiped the pulverized remains of the tick on the fabric of the sunlight shard, then spun to follow the trajectory of her spear. Effie was tired. So tired. She was utterly exhausted. But there was no end to the nightmarish horde. Can't you all just die, bastards? Catching the shaft of the zenith shard with both hands once again, she thrust it back and skewered another abomination with its scooter, then tore the sharp spike away and dashed to the side. A moment later, a terrifying scythe of a carapace centurion sunk into the spot where she had just been. Effie spun the spear and lashed out with it, piercing the chest of the massive creature and killing it on the spot. As the heavy body fell to the ground and sent tremors through it, she had a second to draw in a pained, raspy breath. Her wounded leg almost buckled. Why is no one covering my back? Effie looked around to check on the fellow sleepers who had been fighting by her side but failed to see anyone. All around her, there was nothing but the endless mass of nightmare creatures. Everyone was already dead. Except for her.
Ha, 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 ha.
Effie was left alone in the sea of monsters, separated from the remnants of the Dreamer army by an impenetrable wall of claws and chitin. She only knew that someone was still alive and fighting back there because of the radiant white light that continued to illuminate the vast expanse of the battlefield, of this tomb that they had built for themselves from iron wires and dead nightmare creatures. Not that the light could reach where she stood. Here, there was nothing but darkness. She didn't have much hope of reaching it, too. Effie looked at the ground and smiled bitterly. Then, she raised her head high and stared at the approaching tide of monsters, her eyes sparkling with dark amusement. Come then, beasts. Oh, what a feast this will be. Sunny barely avoided the blade of the coral sword and deflected it to the side with the midnight shard. Then, he tried to counterattack, but was forced to jump back with a muffled curse. A sharp stiletto flew past his face, leaving a shallow cut on his cheek. Damned abominations. Currently, he was facing 3 golems at the same time. The knight, the slayer, and the priestess were trying to surround him. They moved with terrifying speed and possessed enough power to obliterate a sleeper with laughable ease. Luckily, Sunny was not just any sleeper. The shadow was wrapped around his body, making him faster and stronger. With its help, he was barely able to hold on and remain alive. For now, some distance away from him, Saint was facing off against the stranger, the builder, and the hunter. Those 3 seemed to be even more ferocious than his own opponents, so the shadow was having a lot of trouble, too. That doesn't make any sense. Sunny was not surprised that these constructs were far more powerful than him. But Saint was an awakened demon, and one of the most dangerous nightmare creatures of her rank he had ever seen, no less. And yet, she was barely able to remain in one piece. Good thing that the Lord had yet to join the fight. The 7th golem stood motionlessly some distance away, as though uninterested in the fight. Because of how fast his enemies were and their numerical advantage, Sunny had to summon the moonlight shard as well. Now he was holding the tachi in one hand and the stiletto in the other. This wasn't what he was used to and made his offense weaker, but allowed him to bolster his defense. This was one of the reasons why Sunny was still alive. Suddenly, a blast of light hammered into his eyes, making him stagger and blinding him for a few short moments. In the next second, the priestess lunged at him. She wielded no weapons, but her coral hands were deadly enough to serve as a pair of them. Trusting the shadow sense, Sunny dodged and brought the midnight shard down, hoping to catch the golem. His second hand moved, blocking a strike of the slayer. Just as before, the impact almost shattered the bones in his wrist and sent Sunny reeling. He had successfully resisted the attack and bought himself enough time to regain his vision, only to be faced with the furious threat of another assault, this one coming from the night. Saint wasn't having any more luck. Her shield had been caught by the beak of the builder's warhammer and pulled down, which gave the hunter an opportunity to thrust his spear into the breach in her defense. At the same time, the stranger was preparing to attack her from behind. This can't go on much longer, think. Sunny felt as though he was missing some crucial fact about this arduous, lethal fight. He had to solve it before the last golem joined in. Twisting his body to deflect the incoming strike, he frowned. Why had the Lord not attacked? There was something about it. Suddenly, Sunny's eyes narrowed. Can it be? The golems were created in the image of the ancient heroes and even wielded the same weapons. He had managed to resist his attackers for so long partially because he was intimately acquainted with their armaments. After all, he held the Midnight and Moonlight Shard in his hands. If their weapons were the same as his shard memories, just made out of crimson coral, was it the same for the Lord? Did the Crimson Terror create its own equivalent of the Crown of Dawn, and was it currently feeding the 7 golems with power? The Lord was standing alone, seemingly indifferent to the battle that was happening in front of him. Just like Nephi sat away from the battlefield at the start of the siege, the gem of the Dawn Shard burning brightly on her forehead. If the 7th golem was doing to the other 6 what Changing Star had been doing for the Dreamer army, then Sunny still had a chance. Chapter 326 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 12. Glancing at the graceful figure of Saint, Sunny gritted his teeth and made a difficult decision. He had no choice but to do it. Too much depended on his success. A moment later, he feinted an attack and jumped back at the last moment, disengaging from the 3 menacing coral golems instead. At the same time, he sent the shadow a mental command. The taciturn demon froze for a fraction of a second, as though hesitating. But in the end, she did not. Abandoning the measured cadence of her flawless technique, Saint allowed the spear of the hunter to strike her in the chest. The force of that vicious attack was so immense that her onyx armor shattered, allowing the tip of the spear to bite deep into her stone-like flesh. Soon, a stream of ruby dust flowed out of the wound, painting the broken cuirass red. But the shadow did not pay it any attention. Catching the shaft of the spear with her shield hand, she twisted her torso and flung the towering coral golem away. And then, she suddenly dashed to the side. Before the terrible creatures could understand what was happening, she closed the distance and descended upon the 3 abominations attacking Sunny. Even though her attack was swift and unexpected, they managed to react to it at the last moment. The obsidian steel of her dark sword was met by weapons made of crimson coral. It gave Sunny the second he needed to get past them, nevertheless. Dodging the hand of the priestess, he appeared behind the 3 golems and ran toward the distant figure of the Lord. Behind him, Saint challenged all 6 of the golems, tying them down with a ferocious onslaught of attacks. She paid dearly to buy him time, however. Just a second later, another attack got past her defense, leaving a deep crack in the black armor. And then another and another. Ruby dust flowed down like blood. With a terrible grimace contorting his pale face, Sunny rushed to reach the 7th of the Star Sigil Guardians. Kai approached the dark mass of broken flesh and groaning iron wires, feeling cold drops of blood fall on his face. Changing the angle of his flight to move parallel to the ground, he clenched his teeth and lashed out with his sword. The heavy blade of the falcata collided with the iron wires and easily sliced them apart. This net was created from the same thin metal as the webs of iron spiders. As such, it couldn't resist the sharpness of his weapon memory, which was elevated almost to the ascended rank by the miraculous Crown of Dawn. His hand, however, wasn't as strong. Even with his core brimming with soul essence, Kai was still just a sleeper. As soon as he struck the net, a sharp pain pierced his wrist. He screamed, but did not let the sword fall from his hand. Almost. As a long cut appeared on the net, many corpses fell down through the breach. Kai had chosen the target for his attack carefully, making sure that the rain of dead nightmare creatures would fall on the empty stretch of crimson coral between the largely intact line of archers and the remnants of the vanguard, which was embroiled in horrifying melee. But this was not enough. The number of dropping corpses was too small to relieve the pressure from the crumbling net. Dashing through the air, Kai made a turn and flew back. A few moments later, he delivered another strike. A second cut appeared on the net, crisscrossing the first one. With a strange and melodic noise, 4 triangular sections of the net collapsed, creating a wide funnel through which a flood of bleeding carcasses fell. Even more slowly rolled in the newly formed depression, finally allowing sunlight back onto the battlefield. And through that breach, he saw the sky once again. Most of the flying nightmare creatures had been slain by the archers, with just a few still trying fruitlessly to break through the net. But high above them, 5 dark dots still circled in the clouds. As soon as Kai saw them, a cold shiver ran through his body, because it felt as though they saw him, too. A moment later, the messengers broke the perfect symmetry of their circle and plunged down. No! Kai's eyes widened. Dashing through the breach, he dismissed his aspect ability and allowed inertia to pull him down. A moment later, he landed on the carpet of dead monsters and desperately looked for arrows sticking from the bodies. Tearing 1, 2, 3, 5 of them from the flesh of the nightmare creatures, he simultaneously summoned his bow. He would have gathered more, but there was no more time. As soon as his bow weaved itself from sparks of light, Kai pushed himself off the carpet of carcasses and shot upward. Then he looked up. The 5 terrifying spire messengers were descending upon him, wind whistling through their gruesome black feathers. Hunger and madness were burning in their eyes. For some reason, it felt as though the heavens themselves were falling on him. Flying toward the fallen monsters, Kai desperately drew his bow and sent an arrow in their direction, then 2, 3, 4, and finally 5. At that point, the messengers were close enough to see every detail of their repulsive pale bodies. The arrows Kai shot were mundane ones, and thus unable to do much damage to these harrowing abominations, unless aimed perfectly by a master of the bow. All 5 struck the base of one of the messenger's wings, damaging it enough to send the vile creature crashing down. Out of control, Kai dodged to the side, missing the second one by just a few meters. The third one was now right above him, its beak opening in a gluttonous glee. That was when Kai made his 6th shot. Only this time, the arrow he sent flying was not mundane at all. It was the blood arrow. The hideous black memory streaked through the air and hit the messenger right in the eye, sinking in so deep that only its fletching remained seen. The terrible monster suddenly convulsed, and then fell down. The melodious voice of the spell sang into Kai's ear. "You have slain a fallen monster, cursed." But he had no time to listen to it. Using the body of the creature he had just killed as a shield, Kai evaded the attack of the 4th messenger. But the last one suddenly appeared right in front of him, leaving Kai no path to retreat, no hope of saving himself. It was too late. The terrifying black beak shot forward. Effie did her best. She really, really did. But in the end, there was only so much that a person could endure. After an eternity of refusing to give up, covered in terrible wounds, she made a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, even. Just the inevitable failure of a body put through too much pain. After delivering another lethal blow, she tried to dodge an attacking monster, but at the most crucial moment, her mauled legs suddenly buckled. With a short yell, Effie stumbled and fell to the ground. The creature didn't give her a chance to stand up again. It jumped atop the huntress, pressing her into the ground. All she had time to do was grab the jaws of the monster to prevent them from closing on her head. Effie wanted to throw the heavy abomination off her, but a moment later, another jumped on it, its mandibles biting into her shoulder. And then another and another and another. Soon, she was buried under a crushing pile of frenzied nightmare creatures, sharp teeth sinking into her flesh. It hurts so much. Effie gritted her teeth, remembering what it was like to see that distant, pure light. Chapter 327C of the Crimson Spire, 13. At the last moment, the coral golem moved, disappearing from Sunny's view. A fraction of a second later, it materialized a few steps away, just outside of the Midnight Shard's reach. Bastard. It was too late to change the direction of his attack. Pulled forward and down by the inertia, Sunny was forced to finish his downward slash and stumbled, falling to one knee. He found himself in a dangerous position, wide open for an attack and with little ability to maneuver. The perverse simulacrum of the Lord towered above him, his powerful frame radiating a sense of harrowing strength. On the forehead of the artificial creature, a polished piece of coral shined with intense crimson light. That light seemed to sap the life from everything it fell upon. Feeling a sudden weakness permeate his body, Sunny gritted his teeth and dashed to the side. A split second later, the fist of the Lord pierced the air with a cracking sound and shattered the ground, sending a rain of debris flying in every direction. Twisting his body, Sunny spun and delivered a backhanded blow before his feet even touched the ground. The blade of the tachi scraped against the vambrace of the golem's armor, leaving a deep gash in it. However, it didn't do a lot of damage. Landing and sliding back on the coral, Sunny thrust his hand forward and sent the moonlight shard flying at the golem's face. The creature easily swatted it away with its hand. By the time it did, however, Sunny was already near, delivering a high thrust with the midnight shard. As soon as the Lord moved to deflect the austere blade, he changed the direction of his attack and turned it into a vicious horizontal cut. Using every last bit of his finesse and prowess, Sunny brought down a rain of strikes on the golem. He was moving with astonishing speed and agility, his attacks and steps seamlessly flowing from one into another. It was as though the whole onslaught was just one fluid, continuous motion. But no matter how swift and skilled he was, it all turned out to be useless. The Lord was much faster, stronger, and more powerful. Even though he was temporarily forced to concentrate on nothing but defense, every second that passed spelled doom for Sunny. Because somewhere behind him, Saint was being slowly destroyed by the 6 other golems. And as soon as she fell, he was going to die. Curse you! Pausing for a mere moment, Sunny gave the coral abomination a chance to attack. Its fist shot toward his chest with terrifying speed. Turning his torso, Sunny avoided the blow and caught the hand of the golem between his body and his arm. This position didn't give him any advantage, because the creature was much stronger than him. On the contrary, it immobilized one of his hands and forced him to let go of the hilt of the midnight sword with the other. But it gave Sunny purchase. The Lord raised his second fist, ready to crush the human skull with one deadly strike. High in the skies above the battlefield, Kai was just moments away from death. He had wounded one of the messengers, killed another, and avoided 2 more. But the last one was now upon him, and there was no escape. Time seemed to slow down. With his eyes opened wide in terror, he stared at the swiftly approaching beak of the harrowing creature. No matter how fast Kai was, he knew that this time, he wouldn't be able to evade his end. If only he had one more second, a fraction of a second, even. Fully aware that it was hopeless, Kai changed the direction of his flight. Despite it all, he had to at least try. But it was hopeless. Until, at the last moment, something flashed through the air and collided with the black beak of the messenger, throwing it slightly off course. That gave Kai the fraction of a second he was praying for. Twisting his body, he allowed the beak to pass mere centimeters away from it, crashed into the side of the messenger and bounced off of it, then stumbled away through the clouds. A slender, graceful rapier suddenly appeared by his side and then circled around him, cutting a stray black locust in half. With its pommel facing Kai and its tip aimed at anyone who would dare to attack him, the quiet dancer glided through the air, forming a defensive sphere of sharp steel around the young man. Despite its inanimate nature, the flying rapier somehow managed to convey the feeling of mean, arrogant, and bad-tempered protectiveness. Staring at the elegant echo, Kai couldn't help but smile. "Thank you, Cassie." On the blood-soaked battlefield, a small hill of monsters was moving and shifting, every horrifying creature in it lusting to taste the flesh of the person buried beneath. It seemed as though there was no hope. But what was hope? Hope was something that Effie had abandoned long ago. She didn't need it. All she needed was a roof over her head, delicious food on her plate, and the thrill of the hunt. The indescribable pleasure of being healthy, strong, and living. With a tiny bit of misguided pride mixed in to spice things up. He wasn't willing to die yet, not like this, not without giving it one last fight. Suddenly, a muffled sound resounded from under the hill of monsters. It was a furious growl, full of rage, defiance, and a desperate will to survive. A moment later, the hill shuddered, and then exploded, bodies of nightmare creatures flying away and rolling on the ground. Straining her muscles to the point where it felt like they were about to explode, and then past that, Effie pushed the incredible weight away with her mighty shoulders and emerged from the seething mass of abominations. She was still holding the jaws of the first creature to jump on her with her bleeding hands. With a ruthless motion, she tore them apart and threw the broken body aside. Her fist flashed through the air, crushing someone's skull. Effie had lost the zenith shard somewhere, but it didn't matter anymore. With a bestial growl, she spun and fought, killing one monster after another with her bare hands. She was not going to surrender. She was not going to back down. She was not going to. After a while, no one was there to attack her anymore. Effie didn't know why. To be honest, by then, she couldn't see much. Her vision was blurry and slowly growing dark. Met with the lack of resistance, she staggered and fell to her knees. She tried to draw in a breath, but something was blocking her throat, and something was wrong with her lungs. She couldn't. This is the end, I guess. Through the blurry dark fog, Effie suddenly saw a radiant figure approach. She smiled. Is that you, princess? I hate to admit it, but I don't think I can. It was getting hard to form thoughts. Effie sighed, then closed her eyes, ready to give in to the comfort of oblivion. But then, two cool hands softly touched her face, and purifying white flames rolled through her body, bringing the pain and the agony away. Sunny was entangled with the Lord, the abomination's hand trapped between his arm and his body. The golem didn't seem to care about it that much, however. Instead, it raised his other fist and prepared to deliver the final blow. Before he had the chance to do so, however, Sunny's empty hand shot forward. Grabbing the shining piece of crimson coral with his fingers, he strained for a fraction of a second, and then tore it from the creature's forehead. The polished gem came out of the coral flesh of the terrible creature, dragging countless red threads with it. Sunny pulled as hard as he could, and then twisted his hand, forcing the red strings to snap. Something cracked inside the menacing lord's body, and he suddenly staggered. Without wasting this opportunity, Sunny released the golem's hand, raised the midnight shard high above his head, and then delivered a devastating downward slash. The blade of the Tachi collided with the crimson coral and shattered it, turning the towering figure of the Lord into a rain of crumbling shards. Chapter 328 Siege of the Crimson Spire 14. Left on the top of the tall mound of crimson coral, Cassie stood alone in the darkness. Now that the quiet dancer had left her side, she was back to her previous self.
Lost. Weak.
Frightened. Utterly helpless. The oppressive nothingness surrounded her from all sides. But that nothingness was full of sound. It swelled with the deafening cacophony of the nightmare horde's onslaught. Cassie heard howls, growling, inhuman screams, shrieks, and the scraping of chitin. She heard the clangor of steel and the sound of flesh being ripped apart. She also heard countless human voices calling out to any kind of deity that could save them. Full of fury, agony, bravery, fear, resolve, sorrow, strength, helplessness, hope, faith, despair, disbelief. She heard them dying. Standing above it all, Cassie shivered. She wanted to press her hands against her ears, but didn't. Her terrible vision was coming true, and she was back to being lost in the darkness. Just like before. Worse than before. Almost like on that first day in this cursed, forsaken, lightless land. In this forgotten hell. Back then, she had found herself stranded on a similar mound of coral. Only what surrounded her was the dark sea and not a horde of nightmare creatures. But Cassie didn't know that. She didn't know where she was and what was hiding in the boundless darkness. She only knew that she was alone and helpless, that she was going to die in that lonesome, cold nothingness. She had given up. Sitting down on the hard coral, she hugged her knees and tried not to cry. Abandoned and forgotten, she waited for death. But instead of death, a cold and indifferent voice came out of the darkness. "What are you doing?" That was how she met Nephis, who saved and protected her ever since. Without even asking anything in return, not before, and not after learning of what Cassie's aspect was able to do. Just because she wanted to. Nephis brought her out of the darkness and destroyed the bitter, all-encompassing prison of her loneliness. How was Cassie supposed to ever repay that debt? And then she met Sunny. Sweet Sunny, who pretended to be callous and cruel, but was actually caring and kind. And then she had to make a choice. And now, she had to live with that choice. Or die with it. As Cassie stood, listening to the sounds of slaughter, A sudden gust of wind rustled her beautiful blonde hair. She flinched and slowly turned to face the wind. A moment later, her face paled and her lips moved slightly. No. Left alone, away from the battle and anyone who could have hurt her, Cassie closed her eyes and whispered into the nothingness. A storm, there is a storm. The Dreamer army became much smaller, but still held on. In fact, it was slowly pushing the horde of the nightmare creatures back. As the line of archers ran out of arrows and ammunition, those who had no suitable memories to replace them summoned their melee weapons and joined the vanguard, reinforcing its dwindling numbers. The artisans had done the same, abandoning their siege engines and throwing themselves into the crucible of combat. The nightmare horde, meanwhile, had depleted its seemingly endless reserve of fresh bodies. With no more abominations crossing the bridges of crimson coral and lunging forward to join the massacre, its mass was slowly growing thinner. With changing stars serving as the unassailable core of the human formation and rallying fighters around her, with Effie stalling the entire horde to give the rest of the humans time to mend the breaches in their defense lines, for a few minutes, the flow of the battle froze in fragile balance. The two opposing forces seemed to finally be evenly matched. All it would have taken for the humans to turn that balance in their favor was one last furious push. Come on, hold strong. Lit yourself on fire. Follow the immortal flame. As several people yelled, feeling that the fate of this battle was about to be decided, a gust of wind suddenly blew over the battlefield, bringing with it the smell of salt. The light dimmed slightly. Looking west, they suddenly stumbled and froze for a few moments. Their faces became as white as snow. Behind the crimson spire, an impenetrable wall of darkness was slowly devouring the world. It was approaching the battlefield with terrifying speed, numerous bolts of lightning illuminating its furious depths. A storm was coming. As it drew closer and closer, the surface of the black water that swirled around the island of the Cyclopean Tower suddenly trembled. And then it began to crawl upward. First slowly, and then faster and faster, the black whirlpool swelled and moved forward, swallowing the crimson coral meter after meter, its dark vastness rising and seething. The cursed sea was coming to devour the forgotten shore. The monsters that guarded the crimson spire, however, did not react in the same way as the usual nightmare creatures would have. Instead of scurrying away to find shelter, they howled and shrieked in eerie triumph, and then crashed into the Dreamer army with renewed fury. Expressions of terror and despair appeared on people's faces. But there was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to run. All they could do was stand and fight. Even when the ground beneath their feet became slippery and slick, covered by a thin film of black water. Even when the water continued rising. You have slain and awakened. Your shadow. You have received a... Spinning as soon as the remains of the Lord crumbled to the ground, Sunny dashed toward the remaining 6 golems to reinforce the heavily damaged saint. He didn't listen to the spell, picking up only one piece of information from her words. The coral golems were of the awakened rank. Made sense. Just as a fallen tyrant was not supposed to be able to create minions of the same rank, a fallen terror was most likely not capable of such a feat either. Previously, the coral constructs were fast and powerful enough to make Sunny think that they were fallen creatures. But it was just the effect of the profane gem burning in the Lord's forehead. Just like the Dawn Shard was able to elevate awakened memories to the boundary of the ascended rank, so had the Lord enhanced his fellow abominations, bringing their power close to that of the fallen. But now that he was destroyed, the augmentation disappeared with him. Sunny was confident in his ability to finish off 6 awakened nightmare creatures for the most part. As he ran, a strong gust of wind suddenly hit him in the back, almost making Sunny stumble. What the hell? Throwing a glance over his shoulders, he stared at the skies, his eyes widening. An endless wall of darkness crashed into the crimson spire and swallowed it, painting the whole world black. Stunned, Sunny gritted his teeth and turned away from it, a cold feeling of dread permeating his entire body. Curse it all. Chapter 329 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 15. In front of him, Saint was barely holding on to life. Her armor was broken and painted red by the crimson dust that flowed from a dozen terrible wounds. The visor of the helmet was shattered, together with the side of her face. One of her ruby eyes was missing, replaced by a jagged black hole. As he ran, a vicious blow of the knight's sword got past the shadow's defense and bit into her shield arm, severing it at the elbow. Saint staggered and awkwardly lashed out with her sword. Then, she took a step back and fell heavily to one knee. The menacing figures of the golems towered above her, approaching to deliver the final blow. The war hammer of the builder rose, ready to fall down like a herald of destruction. The spear of the hunter flew forward like a hungry predator. The shadow slightly tilted her head and faced her death. Her eerily beautiful alabaster face was calm and indifferent. The weapons of the profane constructs reflected in her one remaining eye, growing larger and larger as they drew closer. But in the end, all they managed to pierce was emptiness. The wounded saint dissipated into shadows, summoned back into the nurturing black flames of Sunny's core at the last second. In the next moment, a wall of darkness swallowed the empty space in front of the crimson spire, bringing with it pelting rain and hurricane winds. The storm was now upon them. The 6 golems lingered for a few seconds, staring into the raging expanse of the terrifying tempest. They were submerged in its darkness, with only a rare flash of lightning illuminating the world. The wall of rain was so thick that it was almost impossible to see anything through it. Suddenly, they discerned a hint of a movement to their left and swiftly turned, ready to attack the enemy. However, there was no one there. A moment later, though, one of them suddenly shuddered and then crumbled to the ground, its head flying off into the darkness. The flash of the blade that had decapitated it was so swift and unexpected that none of them had time to react. It also came from the wrong direction. The golems spun and raised their weapons, but instead of an enemy, all they saw was a heavy kunai appearing from the wall of darkness and hitting one of them in the neck. The blow was powerful enough to make the golem stagger, but not that dangerous. The wounded abomination simply raised its hand and tore the dagger out of its coral flesh. As it did, however, the figure of the slayer that stood behind the rest of the golems suddenly fell to her knees. A moment later, her head slowly slid from her neck and tumbled down, revealing a perfect, smooth cut. Sunny, who hid in the darkness, bared his teeth in a vicious grin. "This is my domain, wretches. You are my guests now. 2 dead, 4 to go." Realizing that their enemy was capable of hiding in the shadows and seeing in the dark, the golems changed their tactic. The knight, the stranger, and the hunter shifted to stand in a circle, protecting the priestess with their bodies. The priestess, meanwhile, raised her hands to the skies. In the next moment, a blinding light shot into every direction from her open palms, revealing Sunny, who had been just a few meters away from them and preparing to launch another attack. Damnation. On the bloody battlefield, the remains of the Dreamer army were besieged from all sides. They continued to fight with doomed determination, abandoning all fear and doubt. Even though the black water was already high enough to reach their knees, the humans continued to resist the horde of frenzied nightmare creatures, slaying 3 for every one of them killed by the terrifying abominations. Illuminating by the radiant light of changing star, not one of them tried to run. Instead, they stalwartly stood their ground and fought. Some were smiling, and some were even singing. As more and more of them fell, forever disappearing under the cold surface of the cursed sea, the black water kept rising. High in the skies above the battlefield, Kai and the quiet dancer were flying through the nets of lightning, dodging the attacks of 3 relentless spire messengers. The terrible monsters were infinitely faster and more powerful than the 2 of them, but had to rely on their wings to propel their massive bodies through the air. Both Kai and his graceful defender flew thanks to magical abilities, and as such, could maneuver better than the winged abominations. This was the only reason why they were still alive. As Kai dodged and evaded the onslaught of deadly attacks, he pelted the messengers with precise shots of his bow. However, none were as lucky as his first one. The black arrow bit into the flesh of the powerful monsters again and again, drinking their blood, but all that achieved was slowing them down a bit. but he didn't care. He never hoped to defeat the harrowing heralds of the spire. To begin with, he just wanted to keep them away from the people fighting on the ground, for as long as he could. Flying through the storm, struggling against the crushing pressure of the wind and dodging bolts of lightning, Kai gritted his teeth and kept doing just that. Not pausing even for a second after his position was revealed, Sunny lunged forward and delivered a swift thrust, aiming at the closest golem, the knight. The creature moved, deflecting the blade of the midnight shard with a choral parody of the noble weapon. Now that the lord was destroyed, the artificial creatures became considerably less fast and strong. They were no better than carapace scavengers, or maybe centurions, barely more powerful than Sunny himself, thanks to the shadow. However, they were just monsters, while he was something much more deadly. A kid from the outskirts who spent a whole year fighting for his life in the depths of hell. He had the skill, the clarity, and the murderous will of a human. Allowing the midnight shard to slide along the blade of his enemy's sword, Sunny made a step forward and raised his hands. The tachi changed its angle and then easily moved past the knight's defenses, piercing his neck. One twist, and it flew out of the golem's flesh, disintegrating half of his neck in the process. Continuing the motion, Sunny slammed his fist and the hilt of the midnight shard into the golem's face with enough force to break the remaining half. You have slain. Using the grounded footwork that he had learned in the countless spars with the Shadow Saint, he quickly repositioned himself and blocked the attack of the hunter's spear. The stranger was still trying to move past the priestess to join the fight. Sunny had planned to use this to his advantage from the start. Before his current opponent could react, Sunny delivered a deadly counterattack, cutting off one of his arms. A moment later, he pulled the tachi back, thrust it forward, piercing the hunter through the chest, and then pulled it up, cutting the cursed creature apart. You have slain and awakened. The priestess lunged forward, wishing to rip him apart with her bare hands, but was suddenly pulled back by the invisible string that had wrapped itself around her neck at some point in the fight. That was all the time Sunny required. As pieces of coral fell to the ground, the spell spoke once again. You have... With the priestess dead, the stranger was left in the darkness once again. He hesitated and raised his shield, looking at the spot where the enemy had been just a second ago and listening to the sound of water through the roaring storm. However, in the next second, something rustled behind him. The stranger spun and delivered a wide horizontal slash with his sword, but then paused, staring down. His sword hand was gone, cut cleanly at the wrist. Then, something flushed through the rain and streaked across his body. The golem staggered, and then fell down, crumbling into halves as it fell. Breathing heavily, Sunny lowered the midnight shard and looked at the 6 piles of crimson coral that were disappearing beneath the black water in front of him. Then he spat. "Who told you that you can hurt my shadow, bastards?" Turning around, he saw a bolt of lightning hit the gargantuan gates of the crimson spire. Arcs of electricity danced on its stone surface and then dissipated, leaving a ghostly afterglow in their wake. Only the shapes of the 7 stars continued to shine, as though full of energy. Clutching his burning chest, Sunny looked at the black water that was already up to his knees and headed toward the spire. Chapter 330 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 16. As the Dreamer army was drowning in the rising waters of the cursed sea and the insatiable tide of monsters, Sunny approached the Crimson Tower. Far away from the rest of them, completely alone, submerged in roaring darkness, he struggled against the seething mass of black waves and the hurricane winds to cross the last few meters that separated him from the shining star sigil engraved into its gates. Finally, his hand touched the cold surface of the ancient stone. Wiping the rainwater off his pale face, Sunny stared at the radiant shapes of the 7 stars. This better work. Summoning the first of the Oath keys, he lingered for a moment and then carefully inserted it into the black chasm of the keyhole. Separated from him by the vast expanse of the swelling sea of darkness, the surviving sleepers desperately fought the advancing horde of monsters. The black water had already reached their waists, making it hard to move. The army was trying to retreat up the slope of the crimson coral, but the pursuing sea was much faster than them. Changing Star was still slaying one monster after another, her radiance only growing brighter in the tenebrous hell of the furious storm. Raindrops were evaporating as they touched her brilliant skin, its incandescence making even arching bolts of lightning seem pale and bleak. Suddenly, an almost imperceptible ripple ran across the surface of the black water. A gust of cold wind blew over the forgotten shore, sending a shiver running through the hearts of countless creatures. Moving on to the next star, Sunny summoned the second key and put it into the lock. Nothing terrible happened, so he struggled through the water to reach the third one. Terrible? What would that even look like? What can be more terrible than my current situation? As if to answer his question, somewhere behind him, a black tentacle suddenly rose out of the seething waves and blindly whipped through the air. Crashing into a mound of coral, it easily shattered it. A rain of debris fell into the water. Just a moment later, countless others followed the first one. Noticing this new development through the eyes of his shadow, Sunny cursed. Me and my big damn mouth. Luckily, the tentacles were some distance away, somewhere near the remains of the 7 golems he had slain. But as the sea rose, they started slowly moving in his direction. Hurriedly inserting the third key, Sunny dashed to the 4th star. Another oath key slid into its lock. The water was now even higher, forcing him to struggle against its weight. A strong gust of wind hit Sunny in the back, almost causing him to crash headfirst into the stone gates. As he put the 5th key into the keyhole, the tentacles were already alarmingly close. Curse it all! Sunny inserted the 6th oath key into the lock and dove into the black water, swimming toward the last one. Just a few moments before the mass of twisting tentacles descended on him, he found the last shining star and drove the 7th key into its center. Suddenly, the world shuddered. The whole forgotten shore trembled. Out on the battlefield, the surviving humans froze for a second, startled by the sudden change that rippled through the world. The furious onslaught of the wind died down. The torrential flood of rain stopped. The continuous, deafening roar of the thunderstrikes grew quiet. The terrible storm seemed to have ended as suddenly as it had appeared, dissipating into nothingness like a fragile mirage. Even the nightmare creatures attacking them stumbled and paused for a moment, staring at the sky. And then, the dark veil of clouds was broken by a blindingly bright ray of sunlight. As soon as it happened, the restless black water stopped rising, and then flowed in reverse. The cursed sea was retreating. Crap. As soon as Sunny put the last oath key into the 7th lock, the whole crimson spire shuddered. An indescribable sound came from its depths, echoing through the darkness of the storm like a heavy, mournful sigh. And then, the gargantuan gates opened. The giant slabs of ancient stone moved for the first time in thousands of years. The problem was, the gates opened outward, slamming into Sunny and dragging him through the mass of black water with terrible speed. The unexpected blow threw him off his feet and almost caused him to drown, not to mention the fact that it hurt like hell. The opening gate brought him away from the damned tentacles, at least. After a while, Sunny was thrown onto the slope of a tall coral mound. Coughing a few times, he tiredly crawled a few meters up, then fell on the rough surface of the coral and turned around. What Sunny saw made him blink, then open his eyes wide and stare in disbelief. The dark sea was being sucked into the spire. The black water was flowing in reverse, rushing into the enormous doorway. The twisting tentacles and the harrowing creature they belonged to were carried away by that current, disappearing into that blackness. 2. The strange thing was that the amount of water entering the Crimson Spire was much larger than what should have been possible. Sunny expected to see it fill the Cyclopean Tower, but instead, it simply flowed inside and seemed to disappear, as if swallowed by the spire and banished into the depths of the earth. Just a few moments later, the lever of the dark sea began to fall. The storm died down, and the impenetrable veil of clouds was torn apart, allowing sunlight to illuminate the world once again. And in a few minutes, the cursed sea was no more. Sunny stared at the clear surface of the crimson coral, which had been covered by the black waves not too long ago. The bottomless dark ocean was gone without a trace. Even the black whirlpool that had surrounded the island was not there anymore, revealing a deep, uneven, empty semblance of a moat. Then, Sunny stared at the sky, where a furious white sun was hovering right above the tip of the crimson spire. A stunned thought entered his mind. Did we do it? Did he actually destroy the Dark Sea?